One for making the trek down to the office or down to Seattle from where you come from.
Thank you.
We've got a very busy, ambitious schedule ahead of us this week, so we should get right into it. Alan will go through a couple of housekeeping safety things, and then we'll go through a quick round of introductions before we get into the membership piece.
All right, welcome everybody. Good to see everyone here in Seattle this time. And a couple of things. I think many of you have been to our offices before. There's two exits from this room. That's a closet over there, not an exit. So don't go in there unless you want to be in the dark. Outside, there are two stairwells. There's a stairwell about right over there, and then one on the other side of the women's bathroom. Once you leave those stairwells, you would not be able to get back in. You need a card, and only that one would come back in with a card. The bathrooms, men's here, women's over there. Staff are all around, very helpful. If you need anything, just grab somebody also, and they'll be glad to help you. Let's see, anything else in the boardroom? I think that's where we'll be having lunches the rest of the week, in the boardroom, the glassed-in room. There's also a coffee machine in there too, if you would like a coffee from over there. Fancy coffee, I guess. Just ask somebody, they can help you use it. But I think that Kelly's set up some coffee and water in the back here too. If you need anything, just let us know. We'll make it happen. Anything else on housekeeping? The website access to our oh, the www. Yeah, so that's a good point. If you're accessing the IPHC.int website and you get an error, like a 404 or something, just put www.iphc.int in front of it. For some reason, iphc.int doesn't work here. But if you're having trouble accessing it and that doesn't seem to work, just ask one of us, we'll help you.
Thanks very much, Alan. If folks don't already have it, the Wi-Fi access is on the whiteboard behind us too. While everybody here is in the room as the MSAB, there's also potentially folks listening online through the webinar. So we need to make sure that we please use the microphones. If the light is red, your mic is off. If it's green, you're good to go. And I think before we get into all of the arrangements, let's do a quick round of introductions because there are some new faces here. Peter, would you mind starting, Commissioner DeGreef?
Sure.
With microphone, sorry.
I already forgot the first rule. Peter DeGreef, commercial halibut fisherman.
Jeff Kaufman, commercial halibut fisherman from Alaska.
Forrest Braden, Southeast Alaska, both charter, and I actually do own some halibut quota to see as well.
Dan Falvey, Southeast Alaska fisherman.
Chuck Ashcroft, sport fishing.
Chris Bohr, commercial fishing Canada.
Angel Drobnica represents some small boat interest in the Aleutian Islands and Bering Sea.
Alan Hicks, IPHC staff, and I just wanted to note apologies from Dave Wilson, who is at the Pisces meeting in Victoria today, working on international collaborations, and he should be here tomorrow and the rest of the week.
Should have introduced myself at the start. My name is Adam Keizer. I work for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as the regional groundfish manager, and I'm here in this capacity as co-chair-ish. We'll find out that in a second.
I'm Carey McGilliard. I work for NOAA Fisheries at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and I'm a quantitative scientist there. And I'm the U.S. science advisor in this process and the co-chair of the MSAB.
Tom Marking, I'm a sports rep, reside in California.
Scott Mazzoni, Area 2A tribal representative.
Jim Johnson, Deep Sea Fishermen's Union, representing commercial fishermen in Alaska.
Per Odegaard, U.S. commercial fisherman. Michelle Culver, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, here for the Pacific Council.
Jim Lane, Utah Tribal Council, BC.
Sarah Webster, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Division of Sport Fish.
Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome. There's some other staff and advisors in the back of the room as well, or side of the room, if you wouldn't mind saying hi.
Huang, biologist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Canadian Science Advisor.
Piera Carpi, I work here at IPHC with Alan, developing the management strategy evaluation.
Ian Stewart, also part of the support crew for MSC here.
And Steve Keith, Assistant Director here at the IPHC.
Thanks very much, Steve. Do we know if anyone's on the webinar? Do we know if there's anyone who's? That's all right, just curious. Okay, well, welcome everyone. That covers off the brief opening of the session. I'd like to move us into adoption of the agenda and arrangements for the session. So as per usual, all the meeting materials have been posted 90 days before the 30 days, but 90 days for the agenda, 30 days for materials in advance of the meeting. Hopefully folks have had a chance to review those in detail. It is a pretty ambitious agenda, and it is tied very closely to the work plan that we review at every MSAB meeting. I'd like to move that this is the agenda we will go forward with, but first, are there comments from folks, thoughts about either clarifications on the agenda or how the agenda might need to be modified? Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I had some discussions pre-meeting about perhaps taking the management procedures ahead of the objectives. We've done objectives first at every meeting I've been to, and what I found is we often need to circle back and revisit our objectives at the end to make sure we actually have performance metrics and objectives that help contrast between the management procedures we talked about. That didn't really get a warm reception, so I would just say that I do think we need to bookmark time at the end of the meeting again to go back and revisit our performance metrics after we've done the distribution procedures to make sure we actually have stuff that allow us to contrast between them.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that comment. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll just walk through the agenda right now to, I put it together and to give you my perception on why I did it. So what I have learned in the past is starting off on objectives on day one this afternoon is not a good idea. And so I decided not to do that. So we will be presenting the framework and sort of background to the development of the operating model, get everybody warmed up to the idea of what we're doing here in the simulation process. And I noticed that there's a 45-minute break. I don't know why in there. I don't think we'll need 45-minute break today, probably a 15-minute break. I'm imagining, depending on how this goes, that we might be finished quite a bit of time before, and we can start the next topic this afternoon. So I'm hoping to start objectives this afternoon. With that being said, tomorrow is scheduled, the Tuesday is scheduled for objectives all day. That we have a presentation outlined that will have the outcome of tomorrow is to have a defined set of priority objectives for coastwide and distribution, so area specific objectives as well, because we will have to present that to the commission at the upcoming annual meeting. Chris?
You said, sorry. You use the term priority objectives. I know we've talked about primary objectives, secondary objectives, additional objectives. What is a priority objective? When you're saying that, what do you mean?
Priority, I guess, would be synonymous with primary. So priority or primary objective, you can tell me which word you prefer. But that are the objectives that would then be presented to the commission at the annual meeting and would be the main objectives that decide on the management procedures that perform best. Secondary objectives would then be those objectives that we look at in addition to those primary and say, oh yeah, you know, we're having a tough time discerning between these management procedures. We can go to secondary objectives and examine some more trade-offs. But the commission has provided direction that they are concerned defining too many of these primary or priority objectives will make it difficult to make progress and decide on the appropriate management procedures. And they gave direction a year ago on 3 coast-wide objectives. And so we'll review all that when we talk about objectives. But so what I'm trying to do is narrow down to a small set of objectives that capture the different axes that are important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But think of primary as those objectives that when I make a presentation to the commission, that is what the commission will see. And they can examine behind the scenes the secondary.
Dan, do you want some clarification on that? Yeah. Okay, cover when we do objectives. So right now objectives are under item 5, which is on Tuesday, but the request, clarification aside about primary versus secondary, is that we have an opportunity to look at objectives after we've had some discussion around MPs, right? That's what we're looking at? Okay, well, let's, if we can scroll down a little bit, we can see what Wednesday has. There's a bit of time in the afternoon that that might be available if we need to circle back, especially if we are able to get into objectives today. So let's earmark that.
Yeah, so that's what I'm hoping that we. So first of all, I've scheduled a day for each of these topics, and I really don't want them to bleed over into each other, except if we start something early. So tomorrow, at the end of tomorrow, when we take up objectives, we will be finished objectives for this meeting. And so that way we'll be guaranteed to have a full day to discuss distribution management procedures. And Pierre and I have a full day planned for everybody in this room with some group activities. So just rest assured that we're schedule time for management procedures, and I don't want it to do what we've done in the past where we start running objectives into that time slot. So I think we can do that, but it's a good point that maybe we should have some time scheduled to come back to the objectives after the management procedures. However, I'll give you my point of view on management procedures is that I'm very happy to have everybody engaged in developing management procedures, but in theory, if I knew the objectives of the MSAB, I could go away and find the management procedure that meets those objectives. So you don't really need to have a management procedure, be the one who defines the management procedure, as you should really be concerned that it meets the objective that you've identified. But this will be a fun exercise. And then after that, so I should note that before we start the framework today, I will give a very brief review of the program of work, just what is expected before January or February 2021. On Thursday morning, we'll take care of any unfinished business, and then I'll present the program of work for the next 5 years. So really quick, I mean 5-10 minutes, just so we have an idea where we're heading with this group and where people would like to go in the longer term. And then we'll discuss meeting calendars, and then of course the report writing on Thursday. So that's sort of our idea of the agenda. Any questions? And Dan, since you brought this up, are you okay with following this agenda and adding in the revisit of objectives after we discuss management procedures, perhaps?
Yeah, as long as we have time to review our objectives after we've done management procedures to make sure that they still provide the contrast and the information we hope. I'm fine working it left-handed or right-handed on the agenda.
Okay, and then we can, yeah, we have an hour on Thursday morning. If we really run out of time, we can just do that at that point in the day. And then as a reminder, well, I'll cover this in the program of work, but really the objectives that or the outcomes that we're hoping from this meeting, and then what we'll be looking at in the future.
So thanks for that, Alan. And one other point, or maybe 2 other points to remind folks of for the expectations for this meeting. As I've said, it is a pretty ambitious agenda. we have our work cut out for us in terms of making sure we satisfy the work plan that we have previously agreed to with the 2021 delivery of scale and distribution. So these headers that we see in 4, 5, and 6 are the kind of the key deliverables that we're looking to achieve at the end of this meeting. As per usual, these discussions and the recommendations are documented in the report writing session, which is scheduled for the end of every day. Folks are really encouraged to come and participate in that process so that we make sure we've captured the discussion accurately. There's a fair bit of time that's also dedicated at the end of the session to polish those things up.
Yeah, and that's a couple of meetings ago, just to remind everybody, we moved that report writing into the regular workday to occur before 5 p.m. to enable people to stay and help
out. Peggy does pass on her regrets. She'll hopefully be here a little bit later. That was one thing we missed in the go around.
Another addition to the agenda is the potential of a social activity this afternoon or this evening. Wondering what interest there is to maybe meet up at the Urban Family Brewery for a little social gathering. We don't have anything planned supported by IPHC or food or anything like that, but we thought it might be nice before the meeting really kicks off to go and sit down with everybody and just have a more social type of chat.
Yeah.
Sound good? Okay, after the meeting, so it was ending at 5, so like 5:30ish.
Yeah.
Urban Family Brewery is just around up the street a little bit. I'll put up a map later today, maybe during the break or something. What's that?
Kids can bring beer here.
Yeah, it's a family thing. We can brew beer, but I don't think there's anything else on the agenda. We'll discuss a couple other things that on outcomes in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, maybe we can transition to item number 3 then, if given the few suggestions that we've had around revisiting objectives after we've had some, or confirming the objectives after we've had our MP discussion, as long as we're staying within the allotted times that we had set out, that should be good. Let's move forward with that agenda for this week and move on to item 3, which is the IPHC process. Dave's identified as the lead, but I think Alan's going to be taking us through 3.1 as well as 3.2 all the way to well, the rest of the week almost.
Yeah, I'm gonna go Thursday.
So we're starting with paper 2, I think, is that right, Alan?
Yeah, right. So I'll bring up the website.
I forgot to bring up paper 2, folks. Paper 2 and paper 3 are for these next items.
Yeah, so paper 2 is simply the list of documents for this meeting, which are listed here on the website as well. Quick tangent, something I learned recently that might be helpful to people. If you go to the IPHC website and you click on meetings, I've always had trouble getting to a specific meeting. If I wanted to find MSAB014, for example, but I learned about this meeting index link. It's fantastic. Click on meeting index and all the meetings are listed there. You can click on MSAB and now you have access to the websites for all the different MSAB meetings all the way into the past. Do the same thing for SRB, annual meeting, all that. It's just a nice way to navigate the website. So this is the 14th session, the draft list of documents, and what I'd like to bring up first is the membership document. So yeah, so just a couple of things to note about membership, and Jim Hasbrook has been replaced by Sarah Webster sitting at the end of the table, and I apologize, Sarah, I think we spelled your name wrong here, but we got it right later. 50%. Better than weather forecasting. And also that Matt Damiano has resigned from the MSAB and there's been no replacement. He is pursuing a degree in Florida, I think it is. So good for him. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, so I was going to mention another, I believe Craig had noted that he will not be at MSAB 13. He wasn't at MSAB 13. So we have not heard officially from the North Pacific Council on a replacement for Craig Cross. That's the North Pacific Council position. And Steve, do you have anything else other than that?
Yeah, no, we haven't heard yet from them, although we think that they might nominate MSAB alumna Rachel Baker to be their rep. And the other person who's not here today is Joe Morelli, who's coming in late tonight and will be here at the meeting tomorrow. And the other thing I'd like to note is that we also left Angel's name off of the membership list here, but she's here and she's part of that board.
Yeah, Jim. Yeah, so Glenn Merrill is a NOAA fisheries representative, and he's not here at this meeting. So Steve, you mentioned Angel's name is not on this list. Is that right? Did we have an issue with that last time too?
There you go.
Yeah. Is that what happened at the last meeting? So other than Angel, I think everybody on this is current on this list, and your term is noted here as well, being 4-year terms that are staggered. So every 2 years we should have people coming up for term limits, but I would like to note and stress that the end of your term doesn't mean that you have to leave the MSAB, and I really would like to see people stay on. MSE is a longer process, it's an iterative process, and I think the success of MSE is improved by people sticking around and having a longer stake in the process. Jim? No, yeah, but I'm saying if you term out, come back. Bruce Lehman described the MSAB as a life sentence. So. Any questions about membership? Any updates from anybody? So this is document 3, was it? Yes.
Maybe just clarifying the process for membership. So the commission solicits names for the vacancies or for replacements. The commissioners make those appointments. The decisions often do happen intercessionally. We do try to maintain a consistent membership and try to fill those vacancies as they arise. Is that fair?
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. The next document on the list is updates from actions arising at the previous MSAB meeting. That was the MSAB meeting in Sitka, which I just want to say again, thanks to Sitka for hosting that. It was a great time. Thanks to Dan for the barbecue. I really enjoyed being up there and seeing just a few of the stakeholders not part of the MSAB process just come in and observe and chat with them during the breaks. It was really fun. So out of that meeting, that was a really successful meeting for me, and it was a long meeting. We stuck around till I think 5 o'clock on the last day, and I really appreciate everybody's tenacity there. There were a couple of things that came out of there, and what I'm realizing today is I am getting older and I probably need to see an eye doctor. Or sit closer to the screen. But so let's see. So we had, I'm just going to walk down. There were really basically 2 recommendations that came out of this meeting. And as a reminder, we have 2 MSAB meetings a year. So that means we have 2 MSAB meetings before an annual meeting. So that first MSAB meeting is seen as a meeting where we will advance perhaps requests, but not advance as many recommendations to the commission, that is. You can give me all the requests you want. This meeting in October is the meeting where we really draft recommendations that will go to the commission, be presented to the commission and considered by the commission. And that's why Adam's been saying this is a very important meeting. We have some specific outcomes we want in this meeting to bring to the commission to keep the process moving forward. So with that in mind, the last meeting just had a couple of minor things. The first one here was paragraph 12, requested IPHC Secretariat provide a report of research and other relevant research to the extent possible related to relationships between population dynamics, environmental conditions. Noting the 5-year research plan contains a lot of that stuff. Listed a couple other things, migration patterns, productivity by region, climate drivers of Pacific halibut ecology. So during our presentations, we're not going to have a specific presentation satisfying this request, but throughout the week, we have a number of presentations that will address these things. Dr. Carey will be presenting a review of migration and movement that she's been doing. That will occur this afternoon. Really neat stuff. And then we'll present some stuff on productivity in, I think, the management procedures discussion. And so sprinkled throughout this week, we'll be addressing this request. The second request was that the SRB, the Scientific Review Board, consider the draft objectives and provide advice to the MSAB on potential MSY and MEY proxy target reference points. And I have a lengthy presentation on that, but that was presented to the SRB, and they did provide some advice back to us, of which we'll go over the SRB recommendations shortly. So both of these requests have been completed, and you'll see the outcomes of those requests at this meeting. Any questions on outcomes of MSAB 13? Excellent. Okay, so we have outcomes of the Scientific Review Board number 15, and that occurred in September of this year. And there's a few things to note in the outcomes of the SRB meeting. And what we have done, we've just listed the SRB paragraphs relevant to the management strategy evaluation. I'm not going to read everything, but I just want to go by a few of the things that were agreed or recommended, just to highlight the important parts. I don't know why it's doing that. That's weird. It keeps wanting to do that. That's bizarre. Anyways, so let's see. The SRB noted new objectives, and these were some of the distribution objectives, and we'll talk about this in these proportional shares being a different concept than actually defining like a floor or an absolute value that's that would like for a regulatory area. Well, we had a lot of discussion with the SRB, and I'm going to translate that discussion to the MSAB when we talk about the objectives. And then, yeah, Chris?
Sorry, so just we're not going to go into questions on what they said here. You're going to discuss that.
Well, you're welcome to, yeah.
I do, there's a lot of stuff in here that I have a lot of questions on.
If you have questions, sure, bring them up now and I'll try to answer them. But I may defer you to a presentation that I'll give that does address the ESRB recommendation as well.
So 2 points. First of all, just a reminder, folks, please use the mics for the webinar so that everyone can hear the question. And then the second point is there was a lot of information through the SRB reports as well as some of the other reports and subsidiary meetings. So if you have questions, now's the time to ask them. But the response may either be a brief one now or through some of the materials that we're going to see later in the week.
Yeah.
Tom Marking, just to reflect on item number 39, could you maybe kind of brief me on what minimal shares are as versus proportional shares? What were their concerns about that?
Yeah, so this was a discussion that came up during the ad hoc working group meeting on objectives. And we'll go into a lot of detail on this during the presentation on objectives, but it's basically in one sentence. Proportional share means you define a percentage of the coastwide TCUI that you would like to see in your regulatory area, whereas I don't know what they call it. I've been calling it like an absolute amount is like the actual catch level you'd like to see in your regulatory area. So we really had a discussion with the SRB on how those two concepts differ, and we'll present a lot on that in the objectives. So this is your meeting. We can do what you like here if you need clarification on this stuff. I'm just going to touch on the recommendations and some of the higher points. So paragraph 41, but stop me if you see something you want clarification on. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yep.
Just a point of clarification. It says it ignores the biological realities of movement and other processes that remain poorly understood at both the coast-wide and regulatory scales. My question is, does that encompass regions, or are they saying we actually understand it at the regional level?
Okay. Well, I think, no, I don't think they're saying they know it at the regional level. I think what they're saying is that that this transparency discussion that we had is the transparency on a coast-wide level. And while the transparency at a regulatory area level ignores all of the process of movement and other biological things. So I don't think they're trying to get at that we know something at the regional level. I think what they're saying is that it's complex. And if we focus only on a regulatory area, we're going to miss a lot of the process. And similar reasoning why in the past they moved from closed area, regulatory area assessments to a coast-wide assessment.
Okay, so what they're saying there, you think, is that the biological realities and other processes that remain poorly understood, it's basically at the coast-wide, regional, and regulatory level.
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
I think it translates to all those different levels. But I think what they're really getting at is that the stock has to be looked at holistically on a coast-wide level and managed on a coast-wide level. And that just simply focusing on management at a regulatory area level can ignore some of those other processes that happen and lead to a coast-wide stock.
Alan?
Yep.
Could you just summarize what the transparency discussion was?
I think this is related to, if you've noticed in the objectives document, there was a row in one of the tables that says an objective might be to have the mortality or the catch limit, TCY, in a regulatory area is related to local abundance. So that's the transparency idea, is that the transparency idea is that the management is observed to be matching what you're seeing in your area, in other words. And so that came up in the ad hoc working group. And so we had discussion with the ESRB on that. And I think they were a little confused. It's like, well, that's ignoring the what's happening outside of the regulatory area. If you're looking at things at your mortality limits to just match what's going on and in what you're observing in your area, whether that's CPUE or the survey, perhaps. We'll have a little bit more discussion on this in the objectives part, but I think they were just trying to get at that we really have to make sure we're looking holistically as a stock here and not just at local abundances. But there's some ideas to look at the change in the local abundance, like the survey-based management procedure. But even if we do that, we still have to be looking at it on a coast-wide level.
I guess the point I'm trying to understand better is, did the SRB have any concern or indication on whether or not distribution should follow something at a finer scale of abundance than coastwide? In other words, does abundance-based management apply to distribution at anything less than the coastwide scale?
Well, I think we have to be, so I don't think I'm fully understand what you're saying, but you're saying to not distribute the TCY to areas, or to that doesn't matter if it's related to abundance or not, the distribution procedures.
I guess what I'm saying, I looked at our objectives, it seems like originally going into this, there was a discussion that distribution follows some index of abundance at something finer than the coastwide scale, so that you avoided local depletion and you spread fishing pressure fairly evenly across the stock. And it doesn't have to be exactly even, but it wasn't all coming out of one regulatory area, right? And so looking at 40 and 41, I'm not clear whether the SRB felt that that's still important to distribute that fishing pressure in some proportion to abundance, and that abundance changes, or whether they feel that just, coastwide is a proper scale to look at everything, or whether they want to look at something on a finer scale than that.
Well, I think given their recommendation in 41, paragraph 41, they actually suggest, setting regional mortality limits in proportion to the modeled survey abundance trends. But, it is interesting what they say there about the regulatory area splitting regions into regulatory areas. But I think what they're saying is that even if you're managing on a region or regulatory area level, you still have to take note of what's happening coastwide. In that local abundances might not be indicative of the best thing for the coastwide stock. That's my guess. I can try to get more clarification on this, but maybe Ian can help. And Carey was at the meeting.
Yeah, just recalling that discussion. This wasn't about about biological sustainability. They didn't change their previous recommendation, which was to consider maintaining the distribution of spawning biomass across regions. This was purely, these bullets were centered around a discussion of specific management procedures and sub-regional approaches. So I don't think there was any discussion of changing their previous recommendation that we consider maintaining stock distribution of spawning biomass across regions.
I guess what I would say, my interpretation of what the ESRB is trying to say is that we do have an idea that the stock operates at these regional levels in this way, that within a year, the stock moves about within a region, but doesn't move a lot between regions in the particular year, but moves across regions in different years, across the years. They migrate quite long distances. And so what I think they might be getting at here is that if we do try to manage at the IPHC regulatory area on local abundance or even a smaller than that we're missing the bigger picture of things. And that it's really that, and I think that's what they're saying, assumptions about within region abundance proportions is that it's probably moving around within that region within the year, depends when you measure it, depends where people are targeting, and that it might not be indicative of a larger population. So, that's all that I can say on their interpretation of this. It's probably going to require a little bit more work with the SRB.
Generally found 40 and 41 confusing.
Yeah, I'm still confused. So,
but that's okay.
Well,
no,
we need to get some clarity on it because I read 40 and I said, okay, I read 41 and I said, hold it.
Just mute your mic.
We need to get some clarity. Maybe we can't get it now, but it's just, I read 40 and I was like, okay. Then I read 41. I was like, hold it. I don't get that.
So, what, I think this was in response to one, the objective that the mortality limits in a regulatory area are related to a local abundance. Of course, what does local abundance mean? That's another question. They were concerned that local abundance might be very small abundances within a regulatory area. That could be a concern and not indicative of a larger abundance, for example. But 41 is really getting at that concept of we may not need an assessment. We may be able to develop a management procedure that is more simple than an assessment, and that being just look at the modeled survey abundance trends by IPHC regulatory area. The nice thing about MSE, we can test these things. We're not, we're not playing with live ammunition here. We can test these things and see how they'd work out in the simulation world and get an idea if it would work out, if it would cause some serious problems. But I would note that we can't just operate at the IPHC regulatory area without acknowledging the larger concept of there's a coastwide stock out there with a lot of biological processes and movement that we need to take into consideration in the management of this.
Just to follow up then, how does 41 differ from what the current status quo is? Where we use the modeled IPH survey times an area specific harvest rate to distribute in theory.
I believe 41 is getting at, you don't even determine a coastwide TCY. Your mortality and your mortality limit in your area next year is determined on what the survey saw in that area. And so it's a real simple procedure. This is what Sean Cox was talking about at the annual meeting, that you have a really simple procedure that is based on the survey abundance index. But we would really need to ground truth that every once in a while with an assessment as well. And just to make sure that we're really not off track. This is similar to what sablefish is doing, but I don't know they do it by area. They do it for one big stock. But it's you could do this by regulatory area. The problem is with the MSE, we'd want to see how bad could it get or how well does it perform. Tom.
Yeah, when I read this, I kind of took it as they're responding more to the direction that we're going to go from coastwide into more regionals and then begin to split those. And they're just kind of saying, yeah, that's okay, but be aware that when you go to that regional to sub-regional, which is biologically based, you're going to start making some pretty big assumptions on movement. I think they're not really directing us. They're kind of cautioning us. Be mindful that when you do this, there's going to have to be some pretty big assumptions. And I think they're kind of taking a 20,000 foot view on this thing. And, you know, we're trying to read maybe more into it than they're really intending. So.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it. If we start managing on a regulatory area level, that we are ignoring some of the larger processes out there.
So I guess what's confusing to me about this statement of number 41 is that it starts off saying that if your objective is to have set your annual mortality limits related to a local abundance, then you should do that at the regional mortality limit level. But then it says in proportion to modeled survey abundance trends by IPHC regulatory area. And then it says that splitting regions into the regulatory areas is not good. So it's taking the survey data from the regulatory area, rolling it up to the region and saying, don't split it back to the regulatory area from which it originated.
Yeah, I see how it's confusing, and I don't think that I want to try to interpret their statement anymore, but just to get clarification directly from them.
Who is the recommendation directed to? The Secretariat?
The ESRB?
Yeah. Like, is this something that we need to resolve for us to move forward, or?
No, I think this is a pretty general recommendation, not really aimed at anything specifically going on right now.
I think, given how vague it is, there's enough wiggle room for us to move forward with how we've been defining management procedures and our objectives. And I'd suggest that we continue the path that we were on in May. And if the SRB wants to clarify, they can provide that later. Forrest?
So not being there at the discussion, are they headed towards like stripping the policy calls at the commission level out of the management procedure, or is that not where this is?
That's really the goal of MSE, is to develop a management procedure that just acts, that it is what it is, and everybody agrees with it and accepts it because it's going to meet their objectives. But that's for any management procedure we develop. I think this is getting at, are there more simplistic ways to determine mortality limits using just the survey data, doing it by regions or areas and other things like that. And I think they were just trying to address the what has been identified as potential objectives that that the mortality limits that stakeholders are seeing in their area match with what the stakeholders are seeing out there, their local abundances, in other words. Instead of the concept of the stakeholders are seeing in their area better CPUE, they've been seeing their survey go up, but their TCY is going down. So it's trying to address that. But as Adam said, it's not hindering us at all. I think this is forward thinking. I think this is actually thinking beyond 2021, to be honest. Yeah.
Just, it was a recommendation where the other ones are noted, so it's like, well, hang on. So, but we'll get some clarity on it.
So what we can do is we'll make a note, and then when we report to the SRB 16 in June, we'll have to report to this recommendation, and we'll just make a note that it would be helpful to better understand the intent of this recommendation before we can mark it as complete or whatever. So I'm going to move on if that's okay. I'm really excited to get on to some other things today rather than trying to figure out what the, man, this is bizarre. And what's that? Well, we're down to 42 through 45. So I'm just going to note that they recommended the MSAB define objectives independently of the management procedures used to achieve them, instead focus on outcomes, consequences they wish to avoid. So this is something that I will present in the objectives. Any questions on that?
Can you give us an example of what you're talking about?
Sure. So this came up from SRB 14. So the June SRB meeting, they put in a recommendation or a request, I can't remember what it was, that said the objective we defined at MSAB 13, where the coastwide objective of the spawning biomass is greater than the trigger fishery point, which was 30%. They noted that that conflates the management procedure and the objective. And they didn't think that was a good idea. And when I thought about it, I agree with them, because if we define the objective to be related to the management procedure, then as the management procedure changes, the objective changes. So I'll give you an example. If we define an objective that we want to remain above the trigger point of the ramp, more than, or with a tolerance of be above that more than 80% of the time. Well, if that trigger point on the ramp changes, then the objective completely changes, and it's not comparable between the management procedures anymore. So they thought, don't confuse or conflate the two, and instead try to work out that objective of what the real objective is, whether that's being on the ramp is causing more variability, being on the ramp has public perceptions, or what that is, and try to just define the objectives independent of the management procedures. So I'll talk.
For example, if an area
go ahead.
wanted to have a management objective of having a minimum catch size of 5 million pounds, for example, is that an objective or a management procedure?
Well, that is an objective that would then create a management procedure. That is a little different in that that would result in the development of a management procedure. But that is a good point. It took me a while to understand their comment here, but I think the real point is to not get focused on, to really try to identify the objective you had and why you really want that objective. And having a minimum catch level is a reasonable objective, I think.
This is a recommendation. I just wanted, when we move into it, is this going to affect our objectives discussion about, some of the objectives are to have specific minimum catch limits as an objective. When I read this, I'm wondering how that reflects on those two.
Dan, I had a very similar question, because I thought about this 5 million pounds. Is that an objective or a management procedure? And I'd see that as being, it's both, and it's one reasonable to move forward with. I don't know if maybe Alan or others at SRB can clarify. Is this recommendation specifically about the trigger and differentiating between stock status points and inflection points in the harvest control rule, that you don't want to necessarily have those being the same?
Yeah, I think that's where this arose from. And it arose at the June SRB meeting, and then they updated it to be, I think they tried to make it more general here. But what I really agree with is that you define your objectives independently of your management procedures, but your objectives might actually lead to the development of a management procedure. But it shouldn't go the other direction. You shouldn't define your management procedure and then you say your objective is to avoid this management procedure. That is a little bit confusing.
So for this trigger example in particular, I think the MSAB maybe had a couple of objectives it was trying to achieve by saying avoid the trigger with 30% probability. Yeah. Some folks wanted that objective because we wanted to stay away from the ramp because of catch variability. Some people wanted that objective because we didn't want to go anywhere near that, in Canadian parlance, the cautious zone. We wanted to stay away from the ramp. We wanted to be high up in the healthy zone. Those are two different objectives, though, that we were trying to achieve with the same means. And I think that's the point the SRB was trying to make, that you don't want to conflate the trigger with a trigger objective with the procedure. But So that said, I think the point that Dan raises is a really important one, that this minimum catch level is both a reasonable objective and procedure. Another example would be this 15% catch variability piece, right? Where that's a reasonable procedure, as we could hardwire that you don't have catch limits varying by more than 15% year over year, or we could define it as an objective with AC or AAB.
And that's the reason that I wanted to bring up objectives before management procedures, so that if we define some objectives and then we find that, hey, we can actually define a management procedure based on that objective. That would be a useful way to go. Any other questions on these paragraphs from the SRB? Oh yeah, here's the conflating statement up above, 44A.
Yeah, that's one of the takeaway from it.
Yeah. So I think that's where they got the 45. So I don't have a problem with 45.
Yeah, I agree. When I read this, I think 45 comes from 44A. I didn't read it past that, but in our notes, it's probably worth flagging the pieces that Dan's raised, and I'm sure others will raise when we get into MPs.
I'll bring that up with the SRB when responding to this recommendation, actually. Okay, moving on. What else do we have in the SRB report? Just noting 47 isn't agreed, and that is related to this presentation that Carey will give later today. They were very pleased to see that kind of work along with the Biological Ecosystems Research Branch. Let's see, the SRB requested initial performance of the above proposals for candidate management procedures be evaluated, presented at SRB 16 2020, which is in our work plan, and that what their above proposals they're referring to is just the general framework. That's the management procedures we will be developing on Wednesday. And at that time, the appropriateness of different performance measures and objectives could be more carefully evaluated. And so this is indicating this iterative process of, as you do evaluations, you may update your objectives and come back to your objectives. So when I say we have priority objectives we would like to present to the commission at this meeting, when we start seeing results, we may learn that some of our objectives need to be updated at future meetings. And then they had a recommendation that the commission develop a standard criterion for achieving a limited set of or one overarching objective. This would ensure that any candidate management procedures achieves common goals with differences in trade-offs between risks and benefits. Doing so will improve the efficiency of the iterative approach as required for MSE. Now it took us, being the MSE team, a little while to understand exactly what they were meaning by this, but we have put together a slide that will hopefully expand on this and help you understand their intent of this and how it fits into our process. So if you have a specific question on that, we can do it now, but it's also, I believe, the last slide of the objectives presentation that I'll give will address this specifically. I think that might be the last. Yes. So the last thing was just noting the program of work. Any other questions on the SRB report? Tom?
This is kind of a comment. I know way back we set a 30-20 as kind of our metrics. And then about a year or so ago, we felt the need to start pushing it up to more 40-20 or 40-25. And I always thought flatfish were really productive. I mean, and I'm curious, why do we feel the need to set things like relative spawning biomass at 36 to 44? It seems like we're going to have ourselves up on that ramp all the time. If these fish are that productive, why are we so concerned about anything over 30%? Why don't we satisfy with a 30-20 rule? Why do we keep edging this thing up higher? I don't understand the need to do that.
Well, I think the outcome of the results, the coastwide results, was most people were agreed to maintain the 30-20 control rule. And what we wanted to do was test how and see how the 40-20 and even the 25-10 performed relative to that rule. And we found that the 40-20 actually increased the variability. So it didn't perform better and was obviously didn't perform better So I would say that we've learned a lot from the results presented thus far, and we're not inching away from the 30-20. We'll talk more about that during the management procedures section.
So, Tom, were you speaking specifically to this 44 Charlie paragraph? Right. So, I think we're talking about different pieces. So, on one hand, the inflection points in the harvest control rule, the 30-20, 40-20, 25-10, those are all pieces that we had still advanced, or that we had evaluated in May, and there was consensus on a 30-20 control rule with some limiters that would reduce variability. A separate discussion was on the biomass target. So how far above that that trigger or this upper stock reference do we want to be? And that's where the 42, 43% SPR had come from. In addition to that SPR target that we had talked about in May, Secretariat had put forward a proxy, an MSY proxy of MEY, maximum economic yield. And the MSAB, at least my recollection is, it said, we haven't had a chance to review this. We'd like some additional input from the ESRB on what MEY is. That's what this paragraph 44 Charlie is speaking to. And then we have paper 7, I think, that we are going to be dedicating. I can't remember if it sounds on my head. Is MEY paper 7? Paper 7 that we're going to be dedicating time at this meeting to talk about. So your question, Tom, I think is you're remembering 30% is maybe a trigger, or 42 is the target, and then there's numbers here up to 48. Why is the target getting larger and larger? So I think that's a fair question that we are going to be spending some time talking about when we address paper 7. Yeah, thank you for raising that, because it's well, it's a helpful reminder, because we had this problem, this issue for a couple of meetings. We talk about so many percentages and numbers. We don't know if we're talking about a trigger, a reference point, anything. And maybe during a break, we can scribble up some of those key figures on the whiteboard that we did that last meeting. I think that was very helpful. So yeah, thanks, Tom.
Okay, Chris.
Just to clarify, you're going to revisit paragraph 51 in a later presentation, right?
That was the one on the iterative process, and yeah, that's the last slide of the objectives presentation. So just remind me if you don't make the link. All right, any other questions on the SRB report? So I have a few tasks that I'll follow up with the SRB, and I'll actually try to get more clarification before the next MSAB meeting, just independently with the SRB members and other IPHC Secretariat. That brings us to outcomes of the 95th session of the annual meeting, and that is unchanged, of course, because we haven't had an annual meeting since the last MSAB meeting. But I just wanted to bring this up in the to remind people what came out of the annual meeting and how that is guiding our process today. There's basically 2 recommendations to be aware of from the annual meeting. The first recommendation is basically the commission recommended the MSAB develop following an additional objective, as well as prioritize the objective, and that is a conservation objective that meets the spawning biomass target. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that at this meeting, and exactly if it's a conservation or a fishery objective, which we spent a lot of time talking at the last meeting as well. I think I got it figured out how I'll convince you all. Then paragraph 62 is the commission recommended the MSAB and Secretariat continuous program work on the management procedure for the scale portion of the harvest strategy, noting that scale and distribution components will be evaluated and presented no later than AM097 in 2021. Let's see, the management procedure best meets the primary objectives is what we had identified with an annual constraint. So what is interesting about this recommendation is that it's continue its program of work for the scale portion, noting that scale and distribution components will be evaluated. And AM97, so my question to the MSAB is, does the MSAB want to make any recommendation or anything on the coastwide results again? Reminder, I showed new results at MSAB 13 that included some additional constraints, and we had a better understanding of constraints. When we go through objectives, we'll talk about how that coastwide results fit into those objectives again. So just think about if we want to, or you as a board would like to make a recommendation on a scale or coastwide management procedure, being an SPR, a control rule, and a constraint. That'll become more clear when I present the objectives related to the coastwide scale tomorrow.
Alan, and then, I'll go, and then Dan. And so Alan, I just had, recalling the last meeting, I think we were pretty close to making a new recommendation, but wanting to see one more performance metric, if I recall. And so is that something, are we gonna take a look at that at this meeting?
Yeah, so good point, Carey. The ad hoc working group actually discussed that a bit in terms of objectives, and they came up with a new idea for the stability objective that is probably more accurately along the lines of what stakeholders are thinking. So I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about that new metric and presenting the consequences of the evaluation based on that new metric compared to what we were using with the AAV previously. So there'll be quite a bit of discussion.
Okay, great. So we'll have some of that last piece of additional information that we can use. Dan?
I know when we were in SICA, we talked about this recommendation, and I'm just trying to refresh my memory on the discussion, because the MSAB's recommendation to the commissioners was for basically a target of 42 or 43, shouldn't be much more aggressive than 40. You don't get much bang for your buck being more conservative than 46. The commission came back and recommended we continue our work, and they pointed out that reviewing it all, the thing that best meets the primary objectives is 40. And then they went ahead and set the target SPR at 47 for 2019. So I guess my question is, if we're silent on changing our recommendation, are we still basically recommending 42, 43 with the two wings on it? Or are we now working under the commission saying, we want you to focus on 40? I know we had this discussion in SICA, but can you remind me on that?
And I think that's exactly my point, Dan. Do we want to make it, or does the MSAB want to make it clear of what their recommendation is to the commission based on the results they've seen and this potentially new objective?
Yeah, that's your summary, Dan, is more or less my recollection. I think the reason the commission or the annual meeting report ended up with this value was because when we met last October and said 42, 43, there was an asterisk in that there was some more simulation work that was going to be done. That was done in November, December 2018, and those are the results that were presented at AM095 that led to the results we see on the screen now with recommendation 02 and paragraph 62. When we met in Sitka, we discussed the outcomes of AM095, but we were reminded that generally the MSAB doesn't make recommendations at the May meeting. We make recommendations at the October meeting for a commission decision. So I think, cheating a little bit, reading ahead, but I think we should be prepared to make a recommendation at this meeting so that we're dispelling any of the ambiguity that's existed from our October 2018 meeting, annual meeting discussions, and then here. That's my personal opinion. I think we should wait to see what the results are, but happy to hear from others.
Well, we can, when we see results,
yeah, exactly.
I think it'll be more clear when, from those discussions, if people want to move forward with a new recommendation. Okay, so that brings us out of there, and we're actually, according to my little time schedule I had in my notes, we're a little bit ahead of time. So what I would like to do right now is give you a review of the program of work over the next 2 years. And I'm noting here that there's 2 presentations that are now posted. on the MSAB014 website. And I'm going to take a look at the program of work presentation. And I do apologize, I wasn't thinking ahead, and I didn't actually get these brought up. So just give me a moment. You can download them if you want. And we'll go here. I really need glasses. MSAB014, and what I'm going to show you is the, yeah, 09, is that what it is?
Paper 9 is the program.
Yeah, program of work. If I click on something wrong.
2 paper 9s there.
Yeah, is that the PowerPoint? No, this
No,
is the
there it is.
PowerPoint. Yeah, thanks.
Wow. It's not just you, I can hardly see too.
Yeah, can I borrow your
That was
glasses?
a big difference.
All right, thanks, everybody. Even though this is agenda item 7, we thought, being the co-chairs and myself and Pierre thought it'd be nice to just have a quick review of our program of work before we get into what we're doing for this meeting so that we can remember what we need to do for this meeting. So here we go. This is what we need to do. So reminder, we have a delivery of MSE results and recommendations in 2021. And at this meeting, MSAB014, we really need to decide on these priority objectives, primary objectives. Do we prefer the word primary? I'm sorry that I switched over to priority if I did. Is that the, okay.
I think we've generally used primary up till now. Our folks, should we continue with primary? Yeah, okay.
I'd prefer, right, even though I didn't. Okay, so decide on primary objectives so that we can report those to the commission at the next annual meeting, and the commission can actually approve those, and then we really have guidance moving forward. We're not running wild. At this meeting and the next meeting, to identify realistic scale and distribution management procedures to evaluate. The reason that we want to identify some at this meeting are so that we can bring back some preliminary results in May so that we can take a look how things are performing. And then as we learned with the coastwide ones, it usually takes a couple iterations because we learn things along the way. So we'll at least have 2 meetings of seeing results and hopefully have a good set of recommendations moving forward.
And is the operative word here, that we've talked about scale, but this is now scale and distribution together.
Yeah, so don't forget about the SPR, the coastwide SPR, the control rule, the constraint on the coastwide level. We'll still be experimenting with those, and when we discuss about management procedures, I'll show you how we're planning to do that. Continue the operating model development, in other words, finalizing all of that in the upcoming months, and have a preliminary model running and evaluating management procedures for MSAB015. We'll be evaluating those results at the 2 MSAB meetings in 2020. And a reminder that MSAB16 is going to be a very, very important meeting. MSAB15 is just going to be a very important meeting. And then develop tools to engage with stakeholders and facilitate communication. That's always something that's in the back of my mind. So as we work through this, if you have any suggestions how we could improve the dissemination of this material to you as well as your constituents, please let us know. We've been trying to develop some tools to help with that. So just a quick reminder, we put together this figure thinking about some other things with our research, and I thought it would be pertinent to present to the MSAB, in that being you have the MSE sort of process in the middle there with the closed loop simulation and all of that. And we see that we have to have this application of the harvest strategy or the application in 2021, that's our deadline. But I just wanted to note that this really is an iterative process where at the top here we have the MSE provides information about objectives, right? We learn about our objectives, and we've done that. We've updated our objectives along the way already. And that's really an immediate feedback or immediate learning process that we get from seeing results. A little bit longer term process is the MSE identifies area where perhaps new research is needed. or how we should prioritize research. And that's really a short to long-term thing, but it gives us an idea of what we don't know about movement, what we need to develop a better multi-area simulation framework, what we need to know about environmental variation, for example. So the MSD is a very important process here at IPHC because it has a lot of different outcomes to it. Right now, we're focused on 2021 application, but noting too that at every meeting, we're going to have this little feedback towards our objectives and be updating our objectives as we move along. So that brings us to the Gantt chart. And this is a Gantt chart that I've been presenting for a while. I've shaded out where we've been, and this arrow shows where we're at right now. So if you note the key down here, the purple squares are when the MSAB and SRB will be reviewing that. So this is October 2019, where we are now looking at scale objectives and distribution objectives. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Notice the red squares are when we'll be delivering results, and that's basically delivering results to the commission. And note that we'll be delivering those results, but after that, this is all light blue, indicating we'll be thinking about it, but we won't be actively engaged in developing this task. So my goal for after this meeting is to have a really definitive set of primary objectives that the commission can agree with or ask to modify. And then we continue thinking about that, and we may adjust them or update them as needed according to the results that we see in the future. The other task here is identifying management procedures. And here we'll be developing some management procedures for scale and distribution, delivering that to the commission. And then based on what we learn, we'll be updating that, narrowing it down, maybe trying some new ones at the next meeting. We're developing the closed loop simulation framework and the operating models here. And of course, that will feed into the evaluation. And this is evaluating scale we've already done. And then evaluating scale and distribution together. We'll be doing those evaluations in May and October next year with delivery of those results in 2021. Outreach tools, always on my mind at least, so please let me know if you have ideas. And then a new row on here is the external peer review. And this is something that, this is an independent external peer review. This is something we'd like to have done in the MSC process to just give it a little bit more clout, I guess, to make sure that we're on the right track and that we're getting an independent review of this process as well. So what I've done is added here is we are putting out an expression of interest soon for a reviewer to come in and work with the MSC team and review the product in, say, April, early spring, so that we can report that initial review, if there are any outcomes, to the MSAB in May, and then have that reviewer come back. Well, also this first review will also allow us to give insight in what we need to develop at the MSAB meeting in May. And then that reviewer will come back and give his or her final review here for report to the MSAB and SRB in fall of next year. So this is just another level of review, another level of reassurance to the commission that this process is appropriate and scientific and done according to international standards. Yeah.
On the peer review, is it a technical peer review like of the modeling, or is it a peer review of this process, or both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've when I first came on, we thought it'd be nice to have a reviewer come and actually work with us and be an independent part of like the MSE team and provide modeling advice. I think we're at the stage now where we really have to focus in on the you know, technically, scientifically, is it done well? Provide advice on the process as well. So I think it's really a holistic review of the MSC process, which I'm not sure how many people in the world can actually do that type of review. So it will be partially dependent on the type of person we get. Their strength may be modeling, their strength may be process. And we may have to just work with what strengths they have. So we'll see who we can actually get. But the announcement, which will be, I believe the announcement will be distributed at the interim meeting, or at least the draft expression of interest. And that is quite holistic, covering a lot of different aspects. So we'll see who we can get.
I think that'll be interesting. And I just want to note that 2 of the people on the SRB are like our utmost worldwide experts on management strategy evaluation already.
So they're out of the running on that review. They're not independent anymore, but we just wanted to get somebody independent as well.
So if just one follow-up for that to flag for this group is if it is going to include a process evaluation in addition to the technical evaluation, that we need to earmark some of our time on an already busy schedule to support that process. So we'll have to, I guess, flag that pretty early on, like probably close to the end of the annual meeting, to make sure if any of our time needs to be dedicated for that.
Yeah, and what I'm hoping too in that first review is that the reviewer can at least listen in on the MSAB meeting to see the process and how it's being done. I have complete confidence that we're on the right track here.
There's 10 meetings they can record and listen to.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm not sure if we pay by the hour or the day, but.
Back to the top one, I just want to make sure that there is opportunity in our May 2020 meeting to go back and look at our performance metrics after we see results.
Yeah, for sure. It's not that we're cutting it off after this meeting, but I'm not going to dedicate agenda time like a full day of objectives on the agenda, but it will be part of the evaluation process that we will be reviewing the objectives. And that's why I wanted to show the previous slide as well, is that the MSE process is providing us feedback into those objectives. So keep those objectives in mind. What we learn about them, we may update them in May. We may update them in October again, even. But I want to have really a working set of objectives that aren't being, like we're not saying, oh, let's just completely ditch this objective and let's put in a whole new objective. If we're going to do that, I think we have to have a little bit more process and a little bit more of a process where a person that wants a brand new objective brought in as a primary objective, that they come up with a justification for that objective, and we work as a group to make sure that it is appropriate, especially since the commission won't see those objectives until they evaluate the results. So having agreement from the commission now will just help the evaluation and the acceptance of these results in the future.
Man, I appreciate that. I think we do need some agenda time after we've seen results in May to go back and look at the objectives again. I don't think we'll be bringing in new ones, but I remember when we made our recommendation for 42, 43 and stuff, it was really interesting to me to see what are the different metrics each people around the room keyed in on to make those decisions and how that influenced their results. And so rather than finalizing and saying, we're going to make our decision based on this, I think it's really worthwhile to see what the results are, see how people process that information and what they find to be important, and be able to somehow communicate that to the commissioners.
Yeah, if I may respond to that real quick. And I agree, Dan. I think that is important. However, at this annual meeting, we really need to show progress. And one way that we can show progress is that we have defined a set of objectives, noting that those objectives may be adjusted in the future. However, if we start defining objectives based on the results, then that's where the independent reviewer is probably going to say the process is breaking down. So I do have concern about that. But noting that, I think we learned a lot at MSAB 12 when we went around the table and people said, based on the results, what are you seeing? And I learned a lot about what people's objectives actually are. And we identified there were some missing objectives there. So, and then I thought you would be one that would appreciate no objectives on the agenda, but yeah. And so, yeah, we'll see how it goes. But my plan was really to just have objectives come up throughout the meeting. But if you want if the MSAB would like particular space allocated to that, then we can discuss that.
I saw Commissioner DeGreef and then Chris and then Tom.
Yeah, just in regards to the peer review, are there expected to be deliverables from the peer reviewer for the May MSAB meeting? And is that going to give you enough time to deliver that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Right now, I imagine the deliverables at that time would be, hopefully, the process is working well, continue what you're doing, and then I'll review, or the person will review the sort of culmination of the MSE in the fall, because that will be the end that we will be presenting to the commission. Another outcome, maybe the reviewer says, you know, I think you might be missing on this a little bit, and hopefully we do have time to redirect at that point and bring that to the October MSAB meeting, and then bring it to the annual meeting. Sort of the worst thing that could happen, which isn't a bad thing that could happen, it happens all the time in reviews, is the reviewer says, I think the mark was missed here and there isn't time to address that at this point, but it should be fixed in the future iterations of this process. And then the commission at the 2021 annual meeting would just have to interpret the results in light of that review. So I think there's enough time for certain things, and that's why we put it in the process like it is. But it's going to be a bench review, which means there might be things left unaddressed on the table.
Thanks.
Chris?
Alan answered my question with his earlier comments.
Tom?
Yeah, I guess maybe time for me to spit this out. I guess I'm confused about one thing. The work delivery program is fine, but the result of this is going to be, we're going to come out with a number. That number is going to have a large range around it. Like we're at 46, that goes from 29 to 60 SPR. We arrive at 42, that's somewhere like 27 to 57 or whatever. When you put that in actual numbers, that's like mid-20s of harvest to like high 60s. How useful is that number? It seems like, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, we're trying to stay in the lane going down a freeway, and what these numbers are telling me, just keep bouncing off the guardrails and you're okay. It seems like there's so much variability in all these numbers. I don't fault the process. I'm just concerned about how useful the result is going to be because of the amount of variability and confidence so wide on these numbers. How are we going to be able to manage on this when we could be anywhere from 27 million to 57 or 58 million, and we're just calling 42 as, okay, that's the mid-range. We could be 50% right or wrong. There's so much uncertainty as to whether we're even close to this amount. I mean, plus or minus 35% is pretty damn big, and we can't seem to narrow that down at all. Any more accuracy? That's what in the back may concerns me all the time with these numbers. There's so much variability.
You're exactly right, Tom. There's a lot of variability, and that's just natural variability in the Pacific halibut stock. Even before the commission was formed, I mean, the commission was formed out of concern of stakeholders of the stock declining to levels they didn't want to see it, or at least the CPUE at that time. And so we have to think about the management of Pacific halibut. Do we want to manage Pacific halibut such that we have a very stable catch limit and the biomass is going to fluctuate up and down? Or do we want to manage Pacific halibut to where we have catch limits that fluctuate up and down and maybe the biomass is a little bit more stable? So we're either following the biomass and the catch levels, or we define a catch level that's constant, even say, and the biomass rises up and down. Now, both of those have their pluses and minuses, and that's what we're here to evaluate. How do those different ways of managing the stock affect our objectives? But we cannot ignore that uncertainty and that variability. And so don't think of it as, how are we going to manage it? You know, like you're concerned that we're going to manage it in light of all that variability. The real question is, how are we going to manage it in light of all that uncertainty that we can't get away from? And that's exactly what we're doing by defining tolerances. So that's one way to deal with the risk. What is your tolerance for getting close to that guardrail when you're driving on the freeway? Might be high, might be low. So I think the process will get us there and come up with a management procedure. And then the stakeholders just have to define how willing they are to accept the amount of variability they're seeing in what is important to them, say catch limit. Right. Anything else on the program of work? And there's a couple more slides in this that we'll present on the last day.
So this is really the key. It focuses on 2021, our original delivery, but you'll see in the agenda and in the paper that we've talked about post 2021 as well. 2023.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Excellent. I'm right on time with my schedule thus far. It's 2 o'clock now. And so I think what we'll do is begin the framework presentation. Let me bring that one up again. I actually closed that window. I can't believe that. Now I got to navigate this whole way again. So this presentation is agenda item 08. Sorry, I'm sort of going backwards on the document list, but that's all right. And this one's on the framework. It's short, but I think there might be a few questions. So subsidiary bodies. And, okay, so I think what we'll do is we'll work through this presentation and we will take a break at 3 o'clock, see where we're at. And if we have time, we'll begin the objectives presentation later today. And so just as a reminder is that we now have a management strategy evaluation team here. Myself, Dr. Carey is sitting over there, and she will present part of this presentation to you. And I'd like to actually invite her up to the table where David Wilson's seat is, if that's okay with her, if you would like. She doesn't have to. Also we have Dr. Steve Barakoff, who is based out of Boulder, Colorado, but is hopefully listening in on this meeting, in here in spirit for sure, and has been contributing a lot to the code and has been a big contributor to the process. And then of course, the rest of the IPHC staff, including Dr. Stewart, has been a big part of the help here. Part of what we're going to discuss in the framework is how we're developing the operating model and all of that, but also the research going into that. And that's where the biological and ecosystems research branch really comes in, and that's headed by Dr. Planas. And they have been extremely helpful to us in developing the material and the understanding and the knowledge that we need to develop the framework and the operating model. So with that being said, starting this presentation, as a reminder, this is a real overhead view of the framework where we're developing goals, objectives, management procedures, doing simulations and evaluation of those management procedures against those goals and objectives with hopefully the outcome of application. And as I always mention, there's these little arrows going backwards, which is that iterative process where they all feed into each other. And we learn about the whole process. And even after application, we'll continue on and we'll learn things from that application, or we might have additional ideas that we want to investigate in the future. So today we're going to talk a little bit about simulation and evaluation, mostly the simulation model for that. Tomorrow we'll talk about goals and objectives, and then Wednesday we'll talk about the management procedures, and then noting application comes January 2021. This is a sort of a view focusing in on that simulation box. This is the view of the framework, what we're calling the framework, and really the simulation framework. And so we're developing a multi-area operating model. That's on the part on the left there that really simulates the population. and the fisheries that are taking catch out of that population or harvesting on that. Those are things that we really can't control. There's a lot of aspects of fisheries that we can't control and we choose not to control. And there's a lot in the population for sure. But what we can control is that management procedure in what data we collect and how we monitor the fisheries and the stock. The models that we use to provide management related quantities like SPR and total mortality and things like that. And then the actual harvest rule that we use, the control rule, the SPR rate, the constraints, how we distribute the harvest, et cetera. And then all of that feeds through the commission and their decision-making process and the TCY that feeds back into the fisheries, results in a total mortality. So there might be some implementation variability between TCY and total and this actual outcome, the removals, feeds back into the population, and then continues again on another annual process. So this is simulating that annual process. And the key here is we are looking for management procedures that meet our objectives, but these management procedures have to be programmable. So in other words, when we develop management procedures on Wednesday, I need to have the specifics of those management procedures defined so that Dr. Barikoff can go away and program those and code them into the program so that they're actually a determined outcome of that procedure. So that's what we're doing here. I just want to note there's a document, the Info 01 document is a living document. Living mean, and it's continually being updated as we make developments. And that provides some of the technical details on the model. If you look at that document, you'll notice it is definitely not complete. And in fact, a lot of stuff should be going into that document that's currently in our heads and in our notebooks. And I'll be updating that document a lot more in the upcoming months. So if you are interested in technical details in between now and say the annual meeting or the May meeting, just email me and say, hey, can I see where you're at with the technical document? We can likely provide that to you. So the halibut operating model, this is really to create an initial somewhat stable population and condition this on historical data. Basically for two reasons: to mimic where the stock is now as a starting point, but also to make sure that the model is representative of Pacific halibut. It's modeling everything in a forward fashion, so it's going to model forward in time. Chris, did you have a question?
Just wondering, given some of the stuff that we've seen for the stock assessment about sex ratio, commercial sex ratio catch, is the operating model tuned to those changes?
So yeah, the operating model has not been tuned yet. So we're waiting for that updated stock assessment with all of the new information coming in. And it will be conditioned to the most recent information that we can get. But you're right, I've worked on MSCs where the operating model has been conditioned to assessments maybe 2 or 3 cycles past. But I think it's important enough, the updates to the assessment now, that we make sure that we're tuned to that. Yeah, so there's a lot of different process in this. We have to model all the dynamics and movement, maturation, natural mortality, all of that, and then especially fishing mortality. And what we will be doing is modeling fishing mortality by sectors within regulatory areas. So there's, on the bottom right is the picture of the different regions, the biological regions. And we will be modeling movement through those regions because that's how we best understand movement on an annual basis. But we will be modeling the fishery sectors by the different regulatory areas, and I'll review that again at the end of this presentation. So just some technical stuff, if you just to make us look super duper smart. And Steve prepared this slide, and because he's super duper smart, I will try my best to interpret it. But basically, we're using the operating models coded in a language called C++. It's going to have a lot of testing and validation. And in other words, the preparation of the model is, there'll be a lot of things done to give you reassurance that it's a well-working, good model representative of halibut population. The management procedures, again, coded in C++ or potentially are, and they'll have a template for just simply adding elements of the management procedure and then be linked to that operating model. And then there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that Steve has been doing that's been awesome, that I really don't understand, and is the reason we hired him. And that's how it's managing all of this modeling stuff with, you know, a lot of large data and other things. The nice thing is that the outcome of this model is going to be easily configurable, flexible, and generalized, hopefully, and maybe even other agencies which can be able to use this model and framework to do MSCs on their own. But the key there is that when we're done with this process, it's not the end of this model. This model can be expanded and to examine all sorts of different questions we may have in the future. So I want to hand it over to Piera Carpi now, and I'll just give you this, and I'll give you the mouse too. It's sometimes slow on the response, but she's going to talk a bit about her review of movement of Pacific halibut. And give me a break.
Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so what I will present today is just what we know about movement of halibut in the area, and that's a map that presents a conceptual model of the main ontogenetic and seasonal migration. So there is a lot going on in this map, so don't worry. I broke it down into layers, and I will walk you through it. But the main things I want you to notice in this map is, well, first of all, you will see there is a big shaded area here, and that represents the home range of halibut, what is known to be the maximum distribution. Down here, I just included a small rectangle, just a reminder of the IPHC convention area. And then there are two more things I want you to notice. First of all is that on the left side of the map, you will see that there are these kind of different arrows, and there are a lot of question marks. And the reason for that is that most of the left part of the map is based on hypotheses, on what we think is happening. There are very few papers, old papers from the 60s, and I've reviewed those. So this is where all this information comes from. On the other hand, on the right side of this map, there are a lot of colorful arrows, and that's where we have most of the information. So that's one thing that I want you really to keep in mind. So first of all, here we have the spawning and nursery grounds. So spawning grounds is where halibut spawns, as yeah, you know. Usually halibut spawn in very deep waters at the edge of the continental shelf, so around 200 meters or even deeper. As you can see, the main spawning areas are located in the Gulf of Alaska, and there are spawning areas in the Bering Sea as well, at the on the Pribilof Canyon, and then there are really few spawning areas in the Western Aleutian Island that we know of. Nursery grounds, what we consider nursery grounds are those grounds that host early juveniles. So basically between 6-7 months of age, so after the larvae settle down, until about 2 years of age, because afterwards the juvenile halibut will start moving again. So those nursery grounds are specifically for kind of those early juveniles. And the main nursery grounds are located in the on the east side of the Bering Sea, in shallow waters. So the continental shelf here is very wide, and that's why the nursery ground is quite big. And then on the west side of the Gulf of Alaska, these are the main spawning grounds. Of course, there will probably be more, but these are where the main nursery grounds are. Sorry?
How big is a 2-year-old halibut? I mean, I understand the 6-monthers are about like that, but how big is 2?
Oh.
20 centimeters? Yeah. 20 centimeters?
So, yeah.
For young halibut, it's handy to just add a 0, and that's your length in centimeters. It works up to about 4 or 5.
Thanks, Ian. Right. So moving on, then we have, once they spawn, the eggs get drifted, are basically an atom stage. So they don't have any active movement, they just get drifted by the current. And the main currents in the area where the spawning areas are westward currents. So they move from east to west, and that's the main movement of eggs and larvae. Larvae as well, so besides moving westward, they also move vertically in the watering column to shallower waters. And by 6-7 months, they are basically at the same level where juveniles are. So they are already quite high in the watering column. Larvae that are spawned in the Gulf of Alaska, some of those actually cross from the Gulf of Alaska into the Bering Sea through the Unimak Pass. So we know that there is some connection here. Another thing that is happening here, which I called larval loss, is some of the larvae will basically get trapped into what is called the Alaskan gyre, and they will never end up into any nursery grounds, and so they will basically die. In the Bering Sea, we assume, based on oceanographic condition, that there might be some larvae that actually gets advected all the way to the Russian coast. So what we know from a very old publication, I think from the 60s, is that there might be spawning areas here and here because they found a lot of eggs and larvae, basically all along this coast. So we might assume that there is a spawning area, but we also know that there is connection. So currents basically move from the east side of the Bering Sea to the west side, and also from here to the north. So there might be connection between the east and the west in terms of larvae. Yeah, and sorry, I forgot to mention that we consider larvae until 7 months of age, 6-7 months of age, because usually then afterwards the halibut metamorphosizes and becomes juvenile. And here I go with juvenile. Yes, Chris.
Sorry, just on that last slide, we had the hypothetical larva migrations in 4 Bravo. Am I missing, like I don't see it in 4B.
Sorry, say it again.
It says at the bottom there hypothetical larval migrations, and it says
Yeah.
biological region 4B. Oh,
no, sorry, no, that's the problem with the colors. Apologies. So these are the biological region, and 4B is related. So it's one of the biological region, and I guess in the presentation on your computer screen you might see the color a bit better, but yeah, here it's not very good. Sorry about that. Yes, Adam.
Maybe just one clarification piece. I had to look it up because it's been a long time since I went through university biology. Ontogenetic migration, it's talking about the migration of the critter as it goes through different life stages.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all it means. I don't know if everyone's on the same page there, but this is as they spawn, they go through the different stages on the wall you see in the back behind me. And as they mature, they occupy different habitats.
Yeah, so yeah, that's what we basically mean. So we distinguish between ontogenetic and seasonal migration. A seasonal migration happens within a year, they move back and forth, and ontogenetic, it occurs within basically a life stage, in which case larvae or juveniles or adults. So each one of those stages has a kind of different way to move. Yeah. Okay, juveniles migration. Yes, sorry.
I don't notice any migrational patterns in 2A or southern 2B. Is there no data to?
So no, we will get there in the sense that this is just basically eggs and larvae. So they will move from the spawning grounds, and most of it will get drifted westward. So, and again, here I'm talking about the main general patterns. Yeah, so that's, but you will see now, I think, yes, now there is some migration there. So these are the juveniles migration. And when we talk about juveniles, it's a bit tricky in the sense that we know that from 0 to 2 years old, more or less, they stay in the nursery ground. And then we know that between 2 years and at some point, they will start moving and they will not be mature yet. So what we found, talking with Ian and Alan, we decided, okay, let's talk about juveniles between 2 and 8 years old, where they will not be mature yet. They will still follow, juveniles kind of migration path. And then we have those kind of transition stage between juveniles and adults that we consider between 8 and 12 years old, also because between males and females, the maturity will happen at different times. They will grow differently. So by 12 years old, 50% of the halibut will most likely be mature, and they will actually can be considered adults and, let's say, follow the migration patterns of adults. And when we decided also to divide between, let's say, 2 and 8 and 8 and 12, around 8 years old, they start appearing in the survey. So it's kind of, it gives us also a bit more of information. So we thought that was a kind of reasonable division into juvenile stages. So concerning juveniles, what happens is that they actually counteract the larval movement. So the larvae moved westward. What the juveniles do is move backwards, and they will move eastwards. Yes.
Oh, sorry. So when you're talking about this autogenic juvenile migrations, is that to 8 years old, or
from 2 years old basically to 12 years old? But you need to consider that between 8 and 12 years old, some of the halibut will be already mature, so they might actually follow the path from adults.
Okay.
But so this path is for sure between 2 and 8 years old, and then 8 to 12, it will be kind of a transition, let's say, transitional years. More questions? Yeah.
Up in the closed areas, you have big blue arrows and small blue arrows. Does that mean most of the fish in the Bering Sea migrate up and only a little bit go back into the Gulf? Or?
Yeah, I will get that. I will get to that in a second. Yeah, thanks for the question. So basically what happens is that from literature, we know that most of the halibut in the Bering Sea will actually remain in the Bering Sea. And we don't know if they will just stay in the east part of the Bering Sea. Some of them might actually migrate, westward. Some of them might actually migrate north. But we know that most of them will stay in the Bering Sea. Some of those will cross back the Unimak Pass and get back to the Gulf of Alaska. But actually, the rate of exchange between the Gulf of Alaska to the Bering Sea is higher than the opposite one. So there will be, let's say that most of the juveniles and the adults will tend to stay in the Bering Sea. Yes, from the Gulf of Alaska, the juveniles will start actually moving eastward along the coast and can go all the way down to 2A. Finally, adults. So for adults, we have two kinds of migration. We have the ontogenetic migration. So we've seen that throughout the whole lifetime of halibut, they kind of keep on moving eastward, or in the case of the Gulf of Alaska, some of those will keep on moving westward. So this kind of transition from west to east will continue throughout their whole lifetime. But they will also undertake seasonal migration. That means that in a year, they can either cover hundreds of miles, or just remain actually in the area, and they will just undertake offshore, inshore migration between spawning grounds and nursery grounds. So they can either move a lot or not moving much. But so what we know about the ontogenetic migration is that from the Gulf of Alaska, some of those will just keep on moving westward. Some of those will keep on moving south and east, so all the way down to 2A, sorry. In the Bering Sea, most of them will remain in the Bering Sea and will just undertake migration from the spawning grounds to the feeding grounds and back to the spawning grounds. So these arrows on the west side of the Bering Sea are actually grayed out because I wasn't sure if, there might surely be some migration from here down south. We know that there is a stock of halibut, which is kind of independent. Genetic analysis have demonstrated that there is a stock of halibut here, which is separated from the rest. So they're probably are moving south, but I'm not sure at which stage they're gonna do it. And possibly some of those will also move back we will undertake migration from the west to the east side of the Bering Sea. And we actually have found that there are, I think, 2 tags, 2 halibut that were tagged on the east side of the Bering Sea that were actually recovered on the Russian side. So there might be some exchange there, but again, the information are very small. Okay, so we've seen another thing that I forgot to mention is that what we've seen from this review is that basically within a year, halibut tend to remain in the same region. So they stay in their region. Then across here, they can move from one region to the next due to this ontogenetic migration, but within a year, we can say fairly that an halibut tend to stay in the same biological region, which is, I mean, it's an approximation, but it's a good approximation, I would say. So how are we actually going to use all this information, right? So we have a lot of information. How are we going to use it into our operational model? So here, this is just a snapshot of the Gulf of Alaska. So you've seen this map already. It's just zoom in. And again, we see that most of the spawning grounds are in the Gulf of Alaska, a bit in the Bering Sea, and most of the nursery grounds are in the Bering Sea and on the west side of the Gulf of Alaska. So what happens when we have to model movements is that, you know, we will have probably a lot of juveniles in the Bering, most of the juveniles in the Bering Sea and in the west side of the Gulf of Alaska, very few juveniles in region 2. And then these juveniles will grow. And what happens is that then adults will spread out all along the coast. Most of the juveniles in the Bering Sea will grow and will remain in the Bering Sea, but we also know that some of the juveniles will actually migrate back to the Gulf of Alaska. So that's how all that I've shown you before is going to actually inform our operating model. Yes.
For the nursery ground in you had the 2 juveniles in 2B. Would they migrate back? You said they'll migrate back, or would they do they stay in that area?
No, I think they will probably stay around here. So they will probably tend to stay in region 2. So they might move, you know, between regulatory areas, but they might, you know, there will be exception. There will be halibut that do exactly the opposite of what I've shown you here. But the general patterns is that in 2, they will probably, most of them, they will probably remain in 2. Yes.
Is there some event that correlates with them moving annually as versus interannually? Is it like when they spawn, that's when they'll break off and go to a different region, or?
I mean, yes, it might happen that their feeding grounds is very far from the spawning grounds, but the approximation will still work because when then during let's say from March to October, they will be in their feeding grounds and they will sure remain within their region. And then it might happen that some will have a spawning grounds that is actually very far. Some will just have a spawning grounds that is right next to them, so they will not move much. But yeah, we've recovered halibut that are, you know, all over the places from all different regions. Yes.
What is the frequency of the trawl to determine what this larvae distributions? I mean, how often are they done?
Well, there are actually many studies that have been looking at the larvae distribution from the past, and they usually, they use both oceanographic modeling, so based on currents, on what happens. So they basically use drift bottles or things like that. And there have been studies in which they actually did the plankton holes. Yeah, there have been different studies in different areas, so I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I have all the bibliography, so I could look it up if.
So you're saying most of the fish spawn either in the Gulf of Alaska or in the Bering Sea. And so the fish in, what is known about the fish in 2A and 2B and where they actually go and spawn?
No, so there is, there are some spawning areas also in region 2. So there are, and they will probably stay around here, and they will probably migrate south. So that's what we know about region 2. Yeah. So there are some spawning areas also in region 2, but most of them are in here, Gulf of Alaska, and there are a few in the Bering Sea.
And so also, do we know anything, so once they spawn in sort of the ones in 2A and 2B after they spawn, do we know anything about where those larvae and juveniles end up relative to the ones that spawn up in the Gulf of Alaska?
Well, I guess the answer to that, you could use, oceanographic models and so there is the Californian current that then merged with the Alaskan Gulf current. So, I mean, these are not unstaged, right? So they will just go with the currents. And depending on the years and on the strength of the currents, they might end up all the way to the west side of Gulf of Alaska or just remain up here. So I cannot tell you in 5-6 months how far they can travel, because it's also depending on the oceanography. But I guess they could travel quite far. Yes.
I was asking you to go back a slide to so looking at 3A, it seems like it's split, and looking at the dark blue arrows. And I understand that that's over time adult migration, but seasonally, do you notice any different migration, seasonal patterns between fish that are the western residents of 3A versus fish that are in the eastern residents of 3A? In other words, does the east side of 3A tend to mingle seasonally with region 2 some, and the west side with 3B, or how does that work?
I mean, what I recall from kind of tagging studies is that the eastern you are, then they probably will more likely travel south. What we know is that from the west side, there will be some that will move in region 4, and some they will probably move all the way to the Western Aleutian Island, even though we know that the Western Aleutian Island is kind of separated again from the rest, but there is still some mixing between region 4 and the east. So, I mean, as an approximation, you might say that throughout the lifetime, they might be more likely to move down south if they are on the east side of Gulf of Alaska. But I wouldn't be, it would be very hard to look at the regulatory area level. I mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you from 3A, they will move for sure in 2, and from 3B, they will move for sure west.
Mostly I was just looking at the seasonal mixing patterns. In other words, do the fish pretty much turn around at the top of 2C and stay within the region 2 racetrack within a year? Or do you think some of those eastern Gulf fish between 3A, the eastern side of 3A, are actually mixing in that same region 2-3 edge?
I mean, I guess they will probably be mixing. It's very hard to draw lines on such a stock. But we know that there are the oceanographic condition in region 3 are kind of a bit different from region 2 and from the Bering Sea. So, yeah, that's surely an approximation, and there will be some mixing. They will not stop at the line and go back. But yeah, I guess that's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in my experience, I think of the stock as the eastern side of 3A tends to mix around that eastern edge of the Gulf of Alaska into 2C and down to 2B.
Yeah.
And the western side is, I think if you look at the size composition of the fish and everything, even the western half of 3A tends to have more small fish in it than the eastern side does. So
Sure.
3A is one of those ones that it's a big area that could get split in two, but it's not.
Right. No, I see your point.
I saw a couple other questions from Jim and Chuck. Maybe we'll stop it there, then let you get through the presentation in case your questions may already be answered. So Jim and then Chuck.
Well, I guess not much so much as clarification, because this has come up before on suggestions that the biological regions shouldn't necessarily be aligning with regulatory regions. And is this just another example of where possibly that biological region in for 2 should be partially into 3A for biological and vice versa? I mean, there's an overlap right from the beginning. And is this just another reason, another uncertainty in the way you lay these out? Thank you.
Yeah, I like.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. I'll actually agree with that and guarantee you that biological regions do not overlap with regulatory areas. We can know that. The lines for the regulatory areas were drawn for management reasons, not biological reasons necessarily, although the biological information went into the drawing of those. But the key here is that we're here to determine how best to manage this stock, and we have to manage it by regulatory area. So if in our modeling exercise, we do decide to draw some line that splits 3A in half, what do we do with that? How do we actually manage it in the end? And I think that creates a bigger complexity than the approximation we're making by modeling by biological region in this sense. But I would agree with you. In fact, biological regions every year are probably changing in what they are. The line Dan's talking about is pretty general line in 3A. And I think I've heard Ian mention in the past, if he could redraw these reg area lines, he'd draw one right up there in 3A. But every year that line is different, you know, it's sometimes more west, sometimes more east. So yeah, it's a pretty complex system. And as Pierre has mentioned, these are real generalizations, and that's what we do with modeling, our generalizations.
It was just a quick thing Alan said is, do we know, and I mean, I understand what your point she made about that, but in terms of where the fishery occurs in 3A, do we know if it occurs mostly on the eastern or on the western side, or is it pretty much spread across the whole area?
It's changed with the IFQ program, but prior to the IFQ program, the fishery was almost entirely contained along the edge in a very thin band. And then after the IFQ program went in the mid-90s, it spread out, and now it covers basically all the halibut habitat. There's certainly a substantial amount of catch in the area on the shelf outside of Cook Inlet and just a little to the west of Kodiak. That's definitely a hotspot, but I would say there's no place in 3A that doesn't get at least prospected. I'll also note that if you want to look at the current distribution, there's some new tools on our website, and you can actually look at the distribution of catch right on the website, maps of catch. So there's some great new tools there that we can take a look at. I can show anybody that's interested during the break.
More question? Okay. I just want to add another thing, that the research team is doing a lot about migration as well. So this is kind of a live map, and as soon as we have new information, we can actually update with, you know, the new information coming in. So yeah, just want to make sure that research is in progress, and this picture might change slightly. Right. So we've seen how all that I've presented you is going to inform the operating model, and I'm just gonna briefly let you know how we're gonna do this in practice, just to give you an idea of the complexity of it. So this is how we will be modeling movement through a transition matrix, which is a very simple matrix in which we have a biological region on the row and in the column. So this is region 1, 2, 3, 4, and again 1, 2, 3, 4. And the body of the table, in the body of the matrix, there will be proportions. So yeah, percentage. So basically you will have, for example, in cell 1, you will have the percentage of fish that will move from region 1 to region 1, and then the proportion of fish that will move from region 1 to region 2, and so on. Since we are modeling 30 age groups and we have 2 sexes, This means that for each one of those combinations, we need to have a transition matrix. And this, as you can see, increases a lot the number of parameters. And that's how, in practice, we are going to do the modeling. I think I will pass it back to Alan.
Curious what's going on in area 4B. You showed that there was spawning going on in there, but not larval movement or anything like that.
So what we know from 4B is that the stock is kind of, there is some genetic differentiation. So there is a bit of mixing between, the rest and 4B, but the mixing is not that strong as in the rest of the region. So we will consider that as, we will allow some mixing, but not as much as for the other region. And the other thing is that the information on 4B, unfortunately, are also lower than the information we have on the rest. But there are actually, I think we will have new information very soon, because there is a program in which they are gonna get samples from 4B. So I mean, we are investigating that, but for now it will be a kind of a simplification. Yeah.
Just first, oops, sorry. Jim, Jeff, Forrest, Tom.
Yeah, thanks. So just a couple of questions for my own clarification. So the arrows, do they signify any degree of my movement, or is it just an arrow? Like, it's not a proportional movement, or it's just, you're not proportionals on those arrows, are you?
No, it's
Okay,
not. So most of the arrows are the same size. The only smaller one are the one that goes to the larval loss, because I mean the number of larvae that get advected in the Alaskan gyre is lower than the rest. Yeah.
Okay, and Jesus, loud. The other one, like, just for my, so when you said that, so autogenic migration, once they kind of get into a region, then they more or less stay in that region
within a year.
Within a year.
Saying, yeah.
Okay. So but the timing of autogenic migration is it ongoing throughout the year, taking away the spawning migration time period?
Say it again.
So is autogenic migration, is it just occurring at a time of year, or is it continual?
So the ontogenetic migration is basically continuous throughout the lifetime, which means that from when an adult becomes, 12 years old to 50 years old, however old it gets, he will keep moving. It might take 10 years, but in those 10 years, he might gradually move eastward. So that's what we mean with ontogenetic migration.
Yeah.
It happens over a long time period, it spans over multiple years.
Okay. All right.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But it's in general, depending on where you are. So it is, say, from the Gulf of Alaska, the middle Gulf of Alaska, it's generally west to east, and then there's some moving of west,
exactly,
of east to west, and you're the other part, and then it kind of moves around like this, and then you get the odd one from the Bering Sea into, and that type of
exactly.
thing.
So that's what we mean, exactly, that there will be a gradual movement. Yeah.
I'm really excited to see the early results of this Halibut movement study. It's really exciting, and it's something that we've been trying to get to for a long time. I understand it's ongoing, but this is really fantastic. My question is there any indication that halibut may return to spawn in the area that they were spawned, much like, I guess there's a new understanding maybe with Pacific cod that they're doing that, and also with salmon. And are you seeing that as well with halibut?
Yeah, there is a lot of degree of homing. So they kind of move a lot, and then they might come back exactly to the same spot to spawn next year. So we've seen that in the tags, in the tagging study, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So a fish that is spawned, for instance, in the Gulf of Alaska then could get floated into the Bering Sea, for instance, grow up a little bit and then move back, or not so much?
Well, right. It could. There are halibut. There is a very small percentage of halibut that was tagged in Gulf of Alaska and is found in the Bering Sea. So it can, definitely. I would say that the main general pattern from the Gulf of Alaska would be to move from region 3 to region 2. That's what you see a lot in the tags. They move a lot between region 3 and region 2. And that's, the oceanographic of the area just allows that. To go to the Bering Sea is a longer journey. But yeah, you can definitely have that. But there is also a high degree of homing, so they tend to return to the same spawning grounds where they were the year before. Yeah.
Forrest?
Yeah, and just that was my second question first, but just a clarification on that then. So you say that they home to their spawn where they spawned the last year, but not that juveniles home to where they were born or spawned.
I'm not sure I can answer. I don't.
And so
I'm not sure.
I'm trying to this west to east migration. I'm trying to think, is it like a hot dog stand where the line's too long, so they just skip that stand and go to the next one, and so they migrate because they're looking for food?
So I guess you had, okay. So I think the juvenile migration is kind of has to do also with the evolution survival of the stock, right? So you have all the currents that bring the larvae west, and that's just oceanographic features that brings all the way west. And then what they do is basically return east for several reasons. First of all, there are favorable conditions. They've been successful before. Nursery ground in the Gulf of Alaska, they're favorable conditions, so they will move east for this region, for this reason. And then in kind of, I guess, evolutionary context, they will just compensate the natural drift that eggs and larvae have westward. So I think there are both those two components, right? So there is both the component that the favorable area are in the Gulf of Alaska, in that stripe there, and then there is something in British Columbia. So that's where they naturally will go, just because enhance the chances of survival of juveniles if they are in a protected area where there is a lot of food, enhance the growth rate. And from evolutionary perspective is also maintain the distribution of the stock to spread out all throughout the area.
Okay, and then just quickly, the spawning areas that are mapped in purple, there's no indication of intensity of spawning there. That's just a geographical description, but would a spawning area down in Southeast Alaska, could there be like half the spawning intensity of some other area? Do you have any information on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's just a representation. All those areas have been recognized to be successful spawning areas. So, if you sample it every year, you will most likely have spawners there. So that's where the spawning areas come from. And most of them come actually from an old paper from the 1973, that he collected a review of all the studies that have been done so far, till then. And then this spawning area have been confirmed later on from our researchers. So yes,
but we don't have any information on intensity.
No, I wouldn't be able to provide that. I don't know if I could, but yeah.
This is interesting because it poses a couple questions to me. It seems like most of the fish caught in the Bering Sea are smaller fish. If the bulk of the fish that stay there, why don't those fish get as big as the fish south of the Bering Sea in the 2A, 2B, and 2C region if they stay up there? And the other thing that kind of makes me think is if the bulk of those fish stay there, then not that many of those fish are actually migrating down into the 2B, 2A region anyway. So if the threadfin sole fishery is catching 5 to 7 million pounds of small fish in the Gulf of Alaska, that really isn't affecting the fishery in the Gulf of Alaska South anyway, if those fish stay up there. Am I correct in that analysis?
So, Ian maybe has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think when Pierre is referring to the bulk of the fish staying in the Bering Sea, the bulk of our tagging data is older fish. By the time they're older, if they're in the Bering Sea, they're staying there. we do have an extensive amount of information showing us that younger fish, not 2-year-olds, but not 12-year-olds, actually do leave the Bering Sea in appreciable numbers. So that the effects of mortality and changes in distribution that occur in the Bering Sea are definitely affecting the stock all the way to the south. And we have an extensive amount of tag recoveries of fish that are tagged in the eastern Bering Sea that are recovered all the way as far south as Oregon.
They do migrate out.
They definitely do migrate
no,
out.
they-
Yeah, Pura set this up in terms of these different life stages, but our tagging data overlaps variously those different things. And so the bulk of our information comes from fish that are older, which don't leave the Bering Sea very often. But the ones that are most likely to leave the Bering Sea are the ones that are a little bit younger. And we do have tagging data that suggests that they leave. But then there's also the very young fish right after post-settlement, for which we have almost no tagging data. And what we do have shows that there is some milling around in the eastern Bering Sea on those 2- and 3-year-olds.
Okay.
So yeah, that would be this arrow here. So they do come back, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think inadvertently my question's been answered. It was going to be on how you recovered and have an idea that they homed like they did, but I'm now assuming that that would be in the surveys, the fish survey, the release of juveniles to make that same determination that they've been then picked up again in the survey as well. And
Well,
that's your determination for that.
That's from tagging data, yeah. That's definitely from tagging data, yeah.
Thank you.
Has the SRB seen this analysis? The reason I ask is just because in one of their comments in their report, it talks about ignoring the biological realities of movement that remain poorly understood. So have they seen this, or is it even with all this new information, it's still poorly understood? That's kind of, it's just one of the great unknowns in life.
Yeah, no, they've seen that. They were very happy with that. I guess, you know, what we are missing is the connection here. So we know there is work to do with the west side of the Bering Sea and with the Russian coast, because this will affect for sure our view on things. Yeah.
It's also the case that it's taken us 60 or 70 years of tagging information to piece together all these arrows, and there's no guarantee that they're all doing the same thing that they were at the time that we identified each little piece.
Right.
Likely there are environmental and perhaps density dependent and all sorts of other factors. And so we don't and will never have the ability to get a snapshot of all of these movement patterns at a particular time. This is an amalgamation of everything we've learned over 500,000 tags put in the water. But that occurred over a very long time span.
Right.
Commissioner DeGree.
Yeah, and what Pure has done is a huge synthesis of information. And it's a great product, but there's still a lot to learn. And I think we're identifying where the gaps are and what we do need to learn. And I just wanted to point it out, Chris, too, that further down in the SRB report, they have that statement, that paragraph, can't remember what number, that they agree and urge the Secretariat to continue these types of analysis. Which one? 47. Yeah, and that was in response to this presentation. So the SRB was very happy with this, very happy to see these types of analyses and synthesis of information come together to help inform movement. And I think we're all getting a lot out of this 5-slide presentation today. I know I'm learning a lot still.
Yeah, good afternoon. What Ian said about time and how things are changing, with respect to climate change, how do you see that affecting migration? Can you see, how are you going to be able to predict what we know that there's climate change? And a secondary question would be about the California current and how you see that influencing the migration.
These are two very tough questions. So we know that I think we are observing, I think in the fish survey, the stock is moving up northern in the Bering Sea. So there is kind of distributional changes that you can already kind of observe that is happening. So we are not sure, what affect that or how this is gonna progress in the future, but we see already that there is something that is changing. How are we gonna model it? What we have is an environmental variable, as Ian is modeling, and basically the effect of of environmental changes will be modeled as success or unsuccess of recruitment, so recruitment failure or success in recruitment, and that will be taken into account into the operating model. And I guess this responds to your first question. Concerning the second question, it was about the influence of the California current in.
Yeah, so just curious if there was an influence of California, of the California current on halibut migration.
To be honest, I'm not sure till where it arrived, the California current.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I don't know how much migration study has been done around in region 2. I mean, I think a lot of the focus has been on other areas, but there's been tags released in region 2. So I'm not sure we totally understand the effects of the California current, but I do know that where the California current and the Alaska current split north and south can change from year to year, and that might have a big effect on migration and spawning success and all that other stuff. So I think the overall picture here is that what Pierre is presenting is our best information of migration and the general pathways. What we have to think about when we're putting together the operating model for this is where the uncertainty in migration is. And I think that's what you're getting at a little bit with climate change. How might migration change in the future under different environmental conditions? And so that's another part of this study that we have to begin to understand and then put into our model. We've talked about this in the MSAB as scenarios, uncertainty, things like that. But that's going to be a big driver on outputs from the model are the types of variability that we put in. So we might actually have a scenario of some climate change model predicts this, and we think migration will change similarly in response this way, and we actually put that in our simulation model. And then we have a contrasting scenario that says there is no change in migration due to future conditions and other things. So I guess as a good reminder to the MSAB in general is we're defining the general pathways, but we also have to define the uncertainty around those pathways to be able to simulate that in our models with the goal of developing management procedures that are robust to the uncertainty and changes in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, and I think that's a good idea. In regards to California current, I just know that I think there's been some analysis of sablefish and how it's influenced the migration patterns.
Sorry. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so while Alan's getting set up, can you get the mouse there as well? Just say, there's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest for the presentation. Thank you for this. It also raises all sorts of questions. Questions asked about, are all spawning grounds equal? Is there different densities of spawning grounds? What is the strength of the migration trends? We know these are kind of general patterns, but what it might mean for periods of time. There's talk about connections with the Western Pacific. What does that mean? How does that play into this? What's the role of climate change and how might that affect migration? Lots of really good questions that MSC is well suited to deal with. One piece at a time though.
Yep. Yeah, thanks Adam, and thanks Pierre for that. I learn a lot every time I see that presentation for sure. Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about the effects of migration on development of objectives, the development of management procedures. And so understanding migration is, in any of the biological systems of Pacific halibut, is very important. But I wanted to move on now. And again, talk to Pierre. She's done a lot of review of all the studies of migration, so I'm sure she'll be around all week. So we talked about migration through these different regions, through these different regulatory areas, and I also mentioned early on that we're modeling movement between regions because that's really the information that we know. We know best the movement between regions. If we were to go to a smaller area like regulatory areas on movement, we don't have a lot of information of movement between regulatory areas, and we would probably have to go to a much more complex model of being seasonal, not just an annual time step in the model, and then model the seasons, which introduces a lot of complexity, a lot more assumptions. So what we're trying to do in this model is balance what's called parsimony with complexity and have a model that is not too complex to where we can just get it completely wrong, but have a model that is not too complex, not too simple, but does a good job at what we want it to do. And that's how we came up with the idea of movement between regions on an annual time step. But we're not ignoring the regulatory areas in this sense. We still need to develop metrics by regulatory areas, and we'll see that in the objectives. A stakeholder is most interested in their regulatory area, where they have quota, where they fish. We also may have a management procedure that's based on a survey index in area or region 2B or regulatory area 2B or something. So we need to develop metrics. We need to develop data by regulatory areas. We might need fishery CPUE by regulatory area. So we can do that in the model we might be modeling across regions, but we can assign proportions of biomass to these different regulatory areas. And we'll be doing research to understand what are common proportions in each regulatory area within a region. And this is the actual biomass, not just the amount of fishing occurring or what the survey sees, but all the biomass, as well as the variability around that proportion in those different regulatory areas. So we will model that. And when you're thinking about objectives and what performance metrics you'd like to see, still think of it on a regulatory area level, because we will be able to report to you the survey index in regulatory area 2B, for example. We'll be able to create that. So, so that will be part of the modeling exercise, but it won't be modeled explicitly by moving halibut between the different regulatory areas. And it's a common way to do things. Yeah, Dan?
So will you be modeling it such that if all of the harvests for region 2 were to come out of 2A, would you be able to determine effects within the region on that, or do you not have that level of resolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way that we're thinking of modeling it right now, and again, objectives and management procedures drive how we build this model. And that's another reason we need to address those now. But yeah, if all of the harvest came out of 2A, then we wouldn't be able to predict really specific consequences on the other areas, because I think in every time step, the way I'm thinking about the model now, in every time step, that population is going to redistribute itself across the whole region. And that's why we're thinking about this in a regional sense, and halibut move within the region. And so our assumption is that a halibut available in region 2 is available to any of the fisheries in region 2. And similar for region 3, 4, and 4B.
So I think that's going to be a shortcoming of the model, because likewise, if we were to take the entire region 3 harvest out of 3B,
yeah,
I think you would see some very pronounced effects. And then it sounds like the model is not going to be able to even approximate what those effects would be, or distinguish the fact that spreading the harvest evenly across all of region 3 will have one effect, and concentrating it all in one part of region 3 would have a different effect.
We will be able to see the effects of, if the management procedure said to take all out of 3B and not out of 3A, then that would definitely come out in the metrics of yield, because 3A would be getting no yield and 3B would be getting higher yield. So we'd see it in that sense. But in the population, you have to think about what is the dynamics of the population. And if we took all the harvest in a year out of 3B and didn't harvest in 3A, how much remixing of the population would occur in that annual time step? And I don't think the effects, I think we might be missing some very minor effects, but in the overall scheme of things, I don't think we will be, because these regions are really mixing populations. Is that the population will redistribute it quite quickly, I believe, through a region, through our current understanding. We can, it's something for us to think about, and that's why I bring up this proportion of the biomass in each regulatory area. If it is something that we find is important in the objectives and the management procedures, and something that we feel is missing in our simulation model, that we might actually then model movement to the regions, assign proportions of the biomass of the different age groups to each of the regulatory areas, and then harvest within the regulatory areas. And then we would be able to get at those effects. But that's really dependent on our assumption of the proportion that we're assuming going to the regulatory areas and how much mixing is occurring. And this is where in modeling, you really have to be careful about what you're assuming in your model and what you think you know compared to what you actually know. And so,
is that also true, that now your model is assuming that there'll be rapid mixing across the whole area? That if you were to substantially overharvest in one area, portion of a region, that the population would flow back in. That's an assumption you're making in the model.
Yes, it is.
Basically an assumption, just like if you were to take a different assumption and assign proportions within each region to the area, is another assumption. So I think it's just, those are two assumptions you're going to make, and it's important to, when you look at the results, to lay out the fact that the model will or will not be able to pick up local depletion effects if the harvest within a region becomes really imbalanced.
Right. It's important to identify what the model can and cannot do. But I think it's also important to identify what you can or cannot model. And I think we're at that point in what we can effectively model. And that's going to be that feedback to the research and the science, is to get at the metrics that we really want to know. We might have to actually do more research and understand the movement within region 2, for example, and for us to get at those effects. But for now, I don't think we have adequate information for us to model those movements between regulatory areas without introducing a lot of uncertainty that might actually come out in the end non-informative anyways. But Ian? It's a good point.
Sorry. Ian?
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to note that when we discussed this with the ESRB, their concern was whether we could even justify keeping regions separate based on what we knew already, not whether it was a sub-region question. And so their concern, and the one bullet we looked at earlier, the one suggesting that we'll never know exactly what migration will be, was really refocusing us back toward regions. And definitely nothing at the sub-region level. So that's where they've been generally in agreement with us that the assumptions that we make right now, we just don't have anything to support going below a regional level.
Okay, so lots of issues with there, and then so getting to the sectors. We are planning to have multiple fisheries in each IPHC regulatory area. So if you remember in the coast-wide MSE model, we are modeling bycatch or non-directed fisheries. We're modeling subsistence fisheries, recreational sport fisheries, and the directed fishery as well. Here, we want to be able to model all those different sectors through, different selectivity patterns, catchability, and other things at the IPHC regulatory area level. So when we're thinking about developing objectives, developing management procedures, think about individual sectors. And the way that a management procedure will work is it will determine a TCUI, or actually a total mortality for each regulatory area, and then that mortality will be distributed to the different sectors through what's already currently done. So for example, catch sharing plans and things like that, and then we'll introduce variability on that. But we're trying to model all the different sectors so that we can get back really as much information as we can on what yield might be for the different sectors when we report the different metrics. And so in summary, just to finish up this presentation, we Pierre and I thought it would be nice just to go back at what is done at coastwide, what is done at regional levels, and what is done at the regulatory area levels. And so on a coastwide level, spawning biomass occurs. We have a coastwide spawning biomass that results in some coastwide recruitment. Now we'll proportion that recruitment in what's called age zero distribution into the different regions, and we'll have movement among the regions. I want to note that fisheries and the survey can always be aggregated up to the coastwide and the regional level, but a fishery and a survey will actually occur at a regulatory area level, depending on the assumptions and how we actually model those too. So it's just, when we put this together, I thought, yeah, that's a nice way to view this. There are things that operate coastwide, there are things that operate across regions, and then there's fisheries in the survey that operate on a regulatory area level. And we're really not modeling anything finer than a regulatory area level per se, other than how a sector may operate if it operates on a small section of a regulatory area level. So that's all that we have for the framework. Are there any additional questions on that? Any of those concepts and the modeling that we're doing? Yeah, it will. And so this is another reason we want to bring back preliminary results in May, is so that the MSAB can look and say, well, you're actually not able to give us what we wanted, and maybe we have to readjust the model to do that. Or, you know, hey, I've heard that this might happen in my sector, so that we can have another go around and make sure that we're getting things correct. So if there are no more questions, I would suggest maybe we break until 3:30 and then we actually start the objectives discussion and presentation at that time.
So Jimmy, just before we break, I'll do a quick recap of some highlights. So we covered membership earlier. We welcomed Sarah, Angel, got regrets from Joe, Peggy, Dave, right? Glenn as well. We spent some time talking about the ESRB report. The takeaway for me for that was there's some clarifications that are needed on what the recommendations are, but the MSAB is going to continue on with what we are trying to do in terms of setting management procedures. I think the specific point of confusion from the ESRB recommendation was having a fishery trigger. That's both a procedure and an objective. And at the break, we'll sketch the harvest control rule on the whiteboard so we can see the difference between those points. In the program of work piece, a couple of important takeaways for me were an action item for us at this meeting to decide if we're going to put forward a recommendation on the harvest control rule, on the SPR value, the inflection points, et cetera, because we put some notional recommendations forward at the May meeting in Sitka. We may want to revisit those. And we'd also were made aware of the pending peer review for the MSC process. So more to come on that, but it's something that we should have in the back of our minds for how it might change what our work is or what our focus is over the next couple of meetings. Big picture though still is January 2021, we've got our deliverables to get out the door. And then our discussion moved into this 4.1 paper where we had lots of good conversation about migration, lots of questions, but I mean, overall, a lot of appreciation for the work that the Secretariat's done, because this is a question we've had there's lots of curiosity about this for some time. So those are the highlights from me. Carey, do you want to add some other points?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the two decision points that I have gathered that we need to make during this meeting are what you said, Adam, about if we want to make a revised recommendation to the commissioners on the coastwide harvest policy, given the updated information we'll have about stability performance metrics. And the other is if we want to make a recommendation to the commissioners on objectives for the analysis moving forward. So those are two decision points that we want to keep in mind. And I'll just add, along with Pierre's migration presentation, which I think was really great and really useful, we spent some time, and we'll spend some more time, I think, talking about the concept of modeling the biological regions within the quantitative framework, and then getting at the regulatory areas by some approximation. And so that's something that I think we'll have to kind of come back to and roll over in our minds to become a little bit more clear on how that's going to work.
Anything else to add from folks around the table on some highlights from the afternoon? If not, we'll take we said 3:30, 20-minute break.
Well, it's
15
up to
minutes?
the chairs. We're meant to break at 4:30 for report writing at the end of the day. So whatever your schedule would like to be, but we can start objectives if you like. I'll just get the presentation posted during the break.
Yeah, well, I just knowing what our break schedule is usually like, I'd be surprised if we get back sooner than 20 minutes. So let's aim for, well, right in between 15 and 20, so 3:30. Let's get back to 3:30, please. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to bring up the objectives presentation while people are getting settled again. And I was notified that this presentation is available online now.
So Alan's just pulling up the presentation. I realized that maybe it wasn't that clear when we broke at the end of just before the break, but we've gotten through today's items. And so we're just trying to make good use of the time when folks are here and work a little bit ahead. Not going through all 55 slides. Yes, now, just not today. We do have time set aside for report writing. We're just gonna whet everybody's appetite.
All right, I think most people are here, and I'll get started on this. So I think we can make some pretty good progress today and then jump into it tomorrow and really get into the meat of it. But I think this will work out well. There's a couple of slides that I have questions from the MSAB on as well. So we'll discuss the objectives, and to begin, we've been talking about this concept of goals, sort of these really overarching goals, and then general objectives within those goals. And so as a reminder, we've been operating under 4 goals recently, and that is biological sustainability, optimized directed fishing opportunities. And I guess my first question to the Canadians on the MSAB is, how does a Canadian spell optimize? Because I looked it up on the internet and in the Canadian dictionary, and it was with a Z, but not with an S. So.
It's British.
Is the S. Yeah.
We mix our words.
Well, so do I. Okay. Well, so I've been swapping back and forth between the S and the Z/Z.
Whatever Microsoft Word corrects it to.
Okay. Okay. That's how I would go. Anyways, that's a tangent. So optimized directed fishing opportunities, which included yield and stability objectives. And then we had 2 other goals: minimize discard mortality and minimize bycatch and bycatch mortality. And those are grayed out right now because the MSAB has actually decided to put those in the parking lot for the time being while we focus on this first MSE for 2021. But they're not forgotten. So within those those goals are general objectives. And really there are 4 general objectives that we've been operating under as primary objectives. Number 1 under biological sustainability was avoiding critical stock sizes. And we'll talk about that. Under optimized directed fishing opportunities, there are 3 general objectives, and I'll explain what general objective means and how that's all broken down in a moment. But that's maintaining the spawning biomass around a target level. This is that objective we've been working on. Limiting catch variability, and then maximizing the directed fishing yield. So as we talk through these objectives, both the coast-wide objectives and the objectives related to distributing the TCUI, keep in mind these 4 general objectives, because what I will suggest at the end are these 4 general objectives for both coast-wide and distribution, and I think it works out very nicely. So just as a reminder, at MSAB014, a number of people actually volunteered to be part of this ad hoc working group meeting to discuss objectives over the summer, which was very, very helpful. We met on, was it July, end of July? I can't remember the exact date. Mid-July, okay. A few people online, a few people came in the office, and we had a a really good discussion, and actually, unfortunately, had to cut off that discussion due to time limitations. But I think a number of things came out of that meeting, and I believe it's an info paper, Info 02, that is the minutes, basically, of this meeting. So some things that came out of the minutes of that were the ad hoc working group agreed that minimizing bycatch mortality may be specified as a general objective under the goal to optimize directed fishing opportunities. So that was a thought that that bycatch mortality may have effect on directed fishing opportunities, although we're not dealing with that now. Yeah, Jim, did you comment?
Go back to the areas that were grayed out.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the process to ungray them, or
yeah,
when we're going to tackle those?
Yeah, sure. So the two grayed out goals here were at the time when I was starting here, we didn't want to bite off more than we could chew at that time. And so we had to make a decision on what we would address now and what we might address later. So I think the process for getting those ungrayed out are, one, we have a very specific goal in mind for 2021. And then at the end of this meeting, we'll talk about plans beyond that, and that might be the opportunity to open up these additional objectives. Fair?
Well, my contention is we're going to have a heck of a time trying to meet, the other two objectives, biological sustainability and optimizing the opportunities without getting a handle on bycatch and wastage.
Yeah, I agree. And so what we're doing currently in the model is we're treating it, those two concepts. Well, we're treating non-directed fishing mortality, bycatch, as a quantity that we do not control in a management procedure, but it's definitely in the operating model. It definitely has effect on the catch. It's just unspecified in the management procedure. So it's still out there, it happens. And then the wastage or the directed fishery discard mortality is modeled as a function of how much mortality there is in the directed fishery and also depend on weighted age. So to summarize, we're including those sources of mortality, but we're including them as something that is happening with variation every year. But if we want to think about management procedures and the trade-offs between those sources of mortality and directed fishing mortality, that's something we'll have to do in the future.
Yes, thank you. I'm just questioning how we move forward from what the commissioners made a decision and a recommendation on regarding inclusion in the TCEY at the annual meeting, and how it would affect how the input we're putting in for the modeling and distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And I note in both the 07 document and the 08 document, you right at the top have specified that that will not be considered, is not to be considered in the TCEY, and yet the recommendations came from the commissioners that it was. Now, how do we address that going forward? Or is that beyond this board's purview?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't quite remember, but what was written in the top of those documents was that bycatch was not being considered. And that's different than well, I guess that is, all that's not being currently considered in the TCY is the U26 portion of bycatch. So we are considering in our, well, it's a great question, Chuck, and that's something that I don't know that we can address it at this meeting because we don't know how the commission is going to respond to their recommendation and how they will introduce U26 bycatch mortality into the decision-making process. So to be honest, I don't have a good answer for you right now because I'm not sure what the outcome is going to be. Depending on that outcome in May, we may come back with a few additional elements of the management procedure that maybe we have to include, but that gives us time to understand how the commission, what they're operating on and what we need to actually include in the management procedure. But for now, U26 bycatch mortality is just source of mortality that's occurring and is related to how many halibut are simulated by the operating model.
So you're saying this will take more discussion at the annual meeting?
Well, they'll definitely have discussion at the annual meeting, the commission, how exactly they want to implement, including U26 mortality in the TCY. It's not just as simple as, okay, now it's in and we'll make our decisions. There's methods that they have to do this, how they have to do this. And I believe Dr. Stewart's working on a paper for the commission on alternative methods that they can implement the accounting of that U26 mortality in the decision-making process. So once we figure out, or once we find out how the commission is going to do that, we'll be on top of it, and we'll make sure that it's included in the simulations of the operating model appropriately. But that might mean in May that we have to come back and maybe adjust our management procedures to include some method that the commission's using, or that the management procedure includes a little bit more than just the TCEY for now.
Okay, thank you.
More explicitly.
I mean, this is one of the ones where I think we want to come back to looking at the first grade out bullet again after we've gone through our management procedures, because I think there are some that we'll be putting on the table that will have a direct impact on wastage. And we would definitely want to be able to have a performance metric that picks up on the changes in wastage as a way of contrasting among some of these management procedures we're looking at. And so I guess I was going to come back and try and ungrade that one out after we've done our distribution procedures, because if we do have some procedures that really will have significantly different wastage components, then we definitely want to have a way of understanding that.
Yeah, but I agree with you. And distribution is going to have a big effect on what we call directed fishing discard mortality. But I do caution that I guess one of the things to be aware of in the MSE process is that it's always easy to keep adding on new things and you never get to a final product. And we ran into the same issue when I was trying to get coastwide MSE results is before we actually finished the coastwide MSE results, we wanted to talk about this distribution of the catch, and completely understandable. But for now, I think the guidance from the commission that IPHC Secretariat has right now is to deliver the product in 2021. I think if we continue adding on too many objectives, we may run into not being able to deliver that product. So I do caution the MSAB on changing direction too much. And if we want to go down this route, I mean, we'd have to identify objectives with wastage. We have to figure out how to model that wastage and other things like that, and make sure that it's a metric we can perform. So it's something we need to know at this meeting, because once we go down this road, next year is really going to be focusing in on the results we have. So I don't know how the MSAB should address that if that wants to be opened up again.
Well, just wait till we get through the distribution procedures and see if we end up shifting distribution off of 032 and onto 026. And if that becomes a recommendation to base distribution on 026 instead of the current 032, then you're doing something different than status quo, and you would want to pick up some way of understanding how that's going to affect things.
Right. I think that we will likely have management procedures that do things differently than status quo, and they might be based on 032 or 026. So the MSAB should think about if that's part of the evaluation process, if that's important to the evaluation of these management procedures, that needs to be specified as an objective. And again, I'm very cognizant on what we have to deliver in 2021, and I'm very focused on that delivery deadline. But good point.
Tom?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. I mean, bycatch is near and dear because I suggested that as all the first meeting. That was my suggestion. We beat that to death for about 4 years, and it's prior to you coming on. I think you guys, you can't control it, you can't change it. So we might as well define it at what it is as a percentage. And Paul Riles many times says close to 20%. It is what it is. Move on. You know, if they can improve it in the future, great. But if we hang this process up by trying to, figure that's going to be worked into our objectives, which we don't have any control over, then we're just going to stymie ourselves. So I just see it as it's background mortality as natural mortality, and just move on from there. That's because we're not, we long ago decided just to put it to rest and move on.
Just to respond, I mean, that's the bycatch component, but I think the wastage component is something a little bit different.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up, that's a good point, Tom, is to not forget these things are being modeled. It's just the evaluation of the results it's not a primary objective that we want to reduce, that we want to minimize the the directed fishery discard mortality wastage. And so it's not like these are grayed out and thus we're not accounting for them or we're not even considering them. They are in the model and they are being considered. But if it's important, and you will get the feedback of those sources of mortality in the actual results that you're looking at. So you'll see, for example, if distribution is done in such a way that increases the wastage in a certain area, that will show up in reduction in yield to the directed fishery, actually landed catch. You'll actually see that in the evaluation of your results, and then maximizing directed fishing yield would be reduced because it increased the wastage component. So we will see that it's embedded, but not explicitly in the objectives. If you do want an objective that says we want to minimize discard mortality, then maybe you could do that, but that will probably be traded off with other objectives as well. It might increase variability or do something like that. And so that's where the key here is identifying the objectives and the trade-offs between them. But yeah, I have not had that on my radar. So it is something that if it is on people's radar for this round, it's something that we should really identify at this meeting.
I would say, I mean, I think while there's appetite to not lose sight of discard mortality and bycatch mortality, I think folks are still largely saying the same thing, maybe just a little bit differently, that, we had agreed, I hope still agreed to close off discussion on objectives at this point in time so that we can facilitate evaluation. And so much as we can't really comment a whole lot more on the objectives until we actually see some of the results. And then once we've gone through some of these procedures, seen some of the results, we can reflect a little more on our objectives as to whether or not they were actually appropriate and we meant what we said there. I think, Alan, you might have a bit of a different perspective about the validity of reevaluating objectives after you see results. I think it's important to reevaluate objectives after we see them. Oh, okay. So I would say that discard mortality and bycatch mortality are things that we should keep grayed out until we've had a chance to see some results. And then it may come up, like Dan, you said, maybe wastage discard mortality is the piece that differentiates between procedure 1 and procedure 2, all else being equal. And that would necessitate us reevaluating or developing a new objective.
I think we'll see how far we get on objectives through this meeting. And if we still have energy on the objectives we have to get through, then maybe we can identify some new ones. But I think that is important to keep in mind is that the ad hoc working group agreed that things like minimizing bycatch mortality are important. And they may not be classified under they may be classified under a fishery goal. The ad hoc working group also agreed to keep primary objectives to a small number for simplicity, which I think the commission would appreciate very much. MSAB members undertake the following tasks before MSAB014 in October 2019 or report their findings at MSAB014. Unfortunately, that really didn't go anywhere. I guess I wasn't aware if that was my responsibility or whose responsibility that might be, but basically we still have opportunity to discuss with stakeholders any specific fishery objectives they may have for their specific IPHC regulatory area. And just getting out in the field and discussing with the different stakeholders, it's like, what's important to you? That might be a starting question. They might say, I just want stable catch, or I want to take as much as I can get every year. That's already helpful. You know, things like, well, you know, if the catch changed by more than this per year, that would be bad. Or if the catch dropped below this per year, that would affect me because of the way the quota is split out, and I would get nothing at the end of it, for example. Just trying to understand what is important to the stakeholders in the regulatory areas, as well as to the different sectors. They may have different objectives. So that will be helpful, but we'll make a lot of progress at this meeting nonetheless. I'll show you how at the end of this presentation. The working group also agreed biological sustainability objectives are informed by science. Hence, the IPHC Secretariat will provide possible options for biomass distribution tolerance. You'll see where this comes in later. Reviewed by the ESRB to present and discussed during MSAB014. The ESRB didn't have a lot of time to discuss this. We were focused on a lot of other things, and so I don't really have anything to report back from the ESRB on this, but the Secretariat has some recommendations for moving forward on this. But in general, the ad hoc working group really defined the frame of which I will be presenting on distribution objectives tomorrow. So just a little bit of background here. I talked about the goals and the general objectives. Those goals are those real overarching concepts. And the general objective is a high-level statement within each goal that reflects a desired outcome. So that could be something like maintain the spawning biomass above a critical limit. It doesn't really have any specifics to it. It's not really measurable, but it's a good objective to have. What you do is you take that general objective and then you define it more specifically into a measurable objective. And that measurable objective has 3 elements: the measurable outcome, which can be a threshold, limit, or quantity that is desired. So that might be not falling below B 20%, spawning biomass 20% of unfished. Or that measurable outcome might be, I want my TCY to be greater than 5 million pounds in my region. It also has a time frame associated with it. The time frame has 2 components. One component is the number of years over which you evaluate that objective, as well as the period in the future that you evaluate it. For an example, it might be a 10-year period in the in the next 20 years or something like that. So we have pretty well defined those. We have a period of 10 years. And we've defined a short, a medium, and a long-term period. And those were identified and reminded of people during the ad hoc working group. And then finally, the tolerance is the level of risk. So you're defining, say, a threshold in the measurable outcome. Well, that means, do you want that to never, ever, ever happen? Which is very unlikely. There might be a really small risk associated with that. Or are you willing to have that happen 20% of the time? So that tolerance is something we will talk about on some of the objectives. But what I want to note is from those measurable objectives, you create a performance metric, and that metric is actually the statistic that the MSE team will put together to report back to the MSAB and the commission during their evaluation. So if all 3 of those elements on that measurable objective are defined, then this performance metric is basically yes or no. Did it meet that objective? Did it exceed that tolerance? Did it exceed the threshold more than the tolerated or the risk level assigned, for example? So you can actually assign a binary yes or no, and that's really useful in narrowing down management procedures. However, sometimes it's really, really difficult to define a tolerance and even sometimes a measurable outcome, like what do you desire? We'll see later that one of the questions I'll ask is what proportion of the coastwide TCY does regulatory area whatever want? And that's like, well, we don't know. So, well, one regulatory area I know does because it's written into the management procedure for the next 4 years. But other areas don't know. And so we can report a statistic of interest. And that basically is a performance metrics without the tolerance and may not even have the tolerance or a threshold limit attached to it. It's just basically like, here's the catch for that regulatory area, and it goes up with these management procedures and it goes down with these management procedures. And so you can identify just what the outcome is, and you can really examine trade-offs with other metrics in that sense. Chris, did you have a question?
I'm just curious on statistics of interest. They've kind of looked back in history. They've bounced around a little bit, like they were to inform the evaluation. In some documents, they're actually referred to as an objective. And I know we're trying to minimize objectives. With the ad hoc committees talked about that. Both times we've had ad hoc working groups. The commissioners have been very clear that they want minimal objectives. You know, when we first started with statistics of interest, we had our objectives, and then there was another table with statistics of interest in it. And I'm just, you know, as we're talking about simplicity, I just wonder if we should just keep that in mind as to how do we make sure we're keeping it as simple as possible.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Chris. And I think bringing the concept of statistic of interest into the primary objectives will help keep it simple. And by that, for example, with our coast-wide objectives, the 3 objectives we worked with last evaluation was maintaining the biomass above a limit, which had a tolerance assigned. So that was a yes or no. Maintaining stability below some limit with some tolerance. So that was a yes or no also. The 3rd objective was just maximizing the yield, which didn't have a threshold, a limit, or a tolerance associated with it. So that's basically a performance metric or a statistic of interest. If the MSAB wants to define the phrase statistic of interest differently, like it's not part of the primary, then we can. But basically what I'm going to show you at the end of this presentation is we can have a mix of objectives that have all 3 elements defined, and some objectives don't have any of the elements defined. And that will work. That will work in our evaluation. And the ESRB was really in agreement with that. So when we get to the end of this presentation, if it's still unclear, please let me know. So the ad hoc working group also identified 3 levels of hierarchy in objectives. And these are basically objectives reflecting biological sustainability and stability and catch limits as a result of natural variability and assessment uncertainty. And these occur at the coast-wide or biological region level. So these 3 categories are really at what level, what spatial resolution they occur at. A second one is the interaction objectives and the effect. They're objectives that indicate the effect one area may have on another. This can occur at biological region zones or regulatory area levels as well. But since its effect on another area, it doesn't occur coast-wide. And then objectives that are solely within our IPHC regulatory area. And that means it's an objective defined independent of any other area that's specific to that regulatory area. An example of that would be regulatory area 3A wants a catch above 10 million pounds, for example. That is just their area. It will have an effect on other areas, but the objective is defined focusing on what they want within that area. An interaction objective, an example would be area 2B wants a certain percentage of the coastwide TCY, where that percentage now is affecting the other areas. And they're thinking about that percentage in relative to the other areas. So that's how you can think of these different categories. And the ad hoc working group tried to identify objectives related to these categories. If any of the members want to bring those up as we're discussing objectives, that would be great. I didn't really link any of these categories to the objectives. So that brings us to, on this previous page, was the idea of management zone. And I've left this slide blank because this was brought up at past meetings, but there has not been enough time to discuss what a management zone is. And I didn't want to try to guess at it. So I guess I opened the floor for discussion of management zone, which as I understand it was something different than coastwide, different than biological region, and different than regulatory area. Yeah, I'm basically looking for a definition of management zone and maybe some more specifics on exactly how we would incorporate that into objectives.
So, go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
I think the term management zone came up in the SICA meeting from Michelle. But I'll tell you what my takeaway was, why I found it interesting, is that there's biological regions that we'll be using to evaluate the biological sustainability objectives, right? And they're an example of but when you divide the quota amongst those, they're actually acting as a management zone as well. Now, you could still evaluate your biological sustainability metrics against the biological regions, but you may end up grouping other areas together for management purposes. For example, I think it was talked about as 2C and 3A have very similar fleets and stuff. And so it might be worthwhile looking at them as a management zone that we would allocate a portion to and then subdivide. 2A and 2B maybe would be another management zone. And then I don't know what you want to do with 3B or whether you want to lump it into the other 4, but you could actually look at biological regions and management zones as 2 separate concepts for evaluating your objectives against. The biological objectives get evaluated against the biological regions, and then some of the fishery stability ones would get evaluated against the management zone concept. And I think the zones we had talked about were 2A, 2B, 2C, 3A, 4A, B, C, 4 C, D, and E. And then 3B, I don't remember whether that was going to get put in with the CDE group or whether it's going to stand on its own.
Thanks, Dan. That's helpful. I guess to clarify, a management zone would be aggregating the regulatory area levels, but not splitting regulatory areas. Is that correct? Okay. Well, I think, I guess my other clarification would be then management zones would be related to fishery objectives, not biological objectives. And that is doable. It might be helpful that 2C and 3A, well, I mean, I'm sure the MSAB could define it better, but as Dan said, the fleets in 2C and 3A are more similar than, say, the fleet in 2B and 2A, 2B and 2A. And thus, they may want to group that together for some reason, whether that's defining an objective. And we'll see during the management procedure presentation and group exercises that potentially you could distribute catch to management zones rather than biological regions.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm just a little bit confused. Is the intent then to have fisheries cross boundaries with each other, or is it just for distribution purpose?
I think it's for distribution. I don't think there was any plan that 2C is going to go fish into 3A. I think it was more for distributing to those management zones and then splitting that to the regulatory area allocations. That's my understanding. I don't, Dan or Michelle can correct me if that's wrong. Yeah, I see nodding heads. So.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the final result of any management procedure that we put in place will be the TCEY by regulatory area for each individual regulatory area. So we're not really here to, at this point in time, investigate a restructuring of regulatory areas or anything like that. So no matter how we get there, we're going to start with a coast-wide TCEY, a coast-wide assessment. And we need to get to TCY for each individual regulatory area. And that could occur through, we'll talk about this more, management procedures could occur through first distributing to biological regions and then regulatory areas, or maybe you go to management zones and then regulatory areas, or maybe you go right to regulatory areas. The other maybe potentially useful part of management zones is defining objectives by zone. So, adding together 2C and 3A and saying our objective is to actually have TCY above this for 2C and 3A combined, or something like that. So we can have that discussion. I guess for the report writing, then we would want to have an identification of what management zones are for clarity and definition of the different objectives and management procedures. And Dan, you said 2A, 2B, 2C, 3A, 3B on its own uncertain, and then all of 4, or 4 and then 4B on its own and 4A, C, D, E.
Well, what are we going to put in the meeting summary about these management zones? I don't know if we've reached any kind of agreement or consensus on them, and even that's the right split that we're just writing down. This is a concept that we haven't really gone too far on, and I would want to make sure the meeting record reflects that.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Chris. Would it be, are folks comfortable at least with putting a definition of what the zones are, or why zones are worth exploring, but maybe not having a consensus yet on what the value of the zone is? Like, could we say management zones are something to explore because just like we understand regions have biological similarities within them, that's why they're grouped that way. Management zones may have similar management regimes, and that's why you'd want to group them that way and leave it there. We don't have to say management zone 2 is 2 alpha plus 2 bravo. Management zone, like along those lines.
Yeah, I think you just see another possible idea that was discussed. Basically.
Yeah, we're just such as.
Yeah.
Instead of these are.
Okay.
Jim, did you have something?
No, I was just.
Right. Okay.
It's not a concept against it.
Not a concept against exploring. I just like, okay, that's not deciding what they actually are going to look like or be right now, because it's, you know, it's, we haven't even sort of looked at it, and, you know, they're, to me, 2A and 2B are really different in management and fisheries and fleets. So I don't see a lot of similarities there, but as exploring the concept, I think it's okay.
Would it, without holding things up, just for, I think, my own understanding, I'm curious if you could take an example of one of those management zones and just tell us more about your reasoning behind it?
Well, I think, for example, 2C and 3A are the only two on the U.S. side that have a charter commercial catch sharing plan between the two of them. 3B doesn't have that same type of split. And so if you want to provide certain levels of opportunity for the recreational sector, you would look at those, potentially look at aggregating those two catch limits to ensure some bag limit that meets both of those. But also, I think in terms of, you know, if you're looking at area allocations, I think that 2C and 3A subdividing have more in common with each other and the ability to cross back and forth and purchase quota across than 2C and 2B does. For example, you know, if, you know, depending on how you allocate things, there is no opportunity for boats in 2C to buy quota in 2B, and there's no opportunity for them to buy quota in 2A if the apportionment somehow disadvantages 2C fishermen. But if the apportionment was to, but they could always transition their quota to 3A on the US side, which if they were in that same zone may help even out some of those problems.
I think Dan's raised some good examples, but what it raises me the question is, how does 2B then relate to 2A? So, I mean, I think there's a lot of discussion there, and there's some good points.
Is it possible to have like 2A is a management zone, 2B is a management zone, 2C, 3A is a management zone, 3B? So we could cut up the pie in many different ways. I think the important takeaway, well, maybe this is more for Alan and the MSC team, is I think this group can get around a definition of what a management zone is, but what the specific management zones are. Is that what we need for this meeting? At the end of this meeting, to tell you these are the zones that need to be considered?
I think the most important thing we got out of this meeting is a definition of what a management zone is, just the general definition of it. And but what we'll find is that as we're working through management procedures later, and I think this is where Dan might be thinking having this discussion would come better during the management procedures. To be honest, I don't think management zone is going to come up in objectives at all, but I think it is going to come up in the management procedures in that I'm going to have everybody write out management procedures, and we have a great way of doing that. But somebody might say, well, I would like to see instead of a biological region as the first step, I want to see it distributed to these zones and then to regulatory areas. And so I think we can describe it as management zone. It adds flexibility to the paradigm of regions and regulatory areas for the management procedures.
Yeah.
And potentially objectives as well.
Is this something where some groundwork might be necessary to recall or find out more about sort of in the catch, that inflexibility in the catch sharing plans or that type of thing when you're defining management zones of like, is that something that is under the IPHCs that commissioners decide on, or is that something that councils decide on? I'm wondering if it would be, if we're going to go forward with the concept of management zone, if it would also be needed to just find out if the IPHC could do anything, could work with that, or if it would be something that, like I would hate for Alan to spend a lot of time on it and then it can't go somewhere, or how would that work, I guess is my question.
Yeah, thanks. That is a good question, something worth thinking about for sure. But I don't think that anything we're developing here is going to interfere with the process as it currently stands, because the final outcome will be a TCY or total mortality or whatever it is by regulatory area. And everything currently now, all regulation is at the regulatory area level anyways. So even if we define a management zone, we're going to, and catch is distributed to 2C, 3A, it has to be decided how then it gets distributed to 2C and 3A, and whether, you know, whatever that procedure is, if that offers additional flexibility to the commission because it's grouped that way, I think that's where management zones come in as a useful concept. Instead of saying you have to go to region, now we offer this extra flexibility of going to these zones first, and then some additional procedure of getting to the regulatory areas. But if we come out at the end with appropriate catch limits by regulatory area, I think it fits into the process fine, but it is worth keeping that in mind in case there is something that might not work out.
Jim.
Yeah, so maybe we need to have a definition of what it means, because I'm thinking of two different ones. Dan's example, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it, is 2 and 3, 2C, 3A. It's now becoming a regulatory area by de facto, because you're talking about, you know, sports guys, recreational fleet. If they didn't have as much in 2C, they had 3A. I didn't quite get your example there, because it sounded to me that you were just saying, well, now we have this different area where we're going to be managing our allocations towards those, you know, this amalgamated area. Is that not what you meant?
No, they're each individual regulatory areas, but on the Alaska side, 2C and 3 are the only two areas that have a catch share plan with their recreational fisheries. And each of those catch share plans are separate from each other. They're not merged. Each one has a different catch share plan with different thresholds about when you get an opportunity for 2 bag limits versus 1 and that type of thing. But just the concept of wanting to try and perhaps essentially allocate a block to 2C, 3A that then gets divided to ensure that there's this opportunity first, and then you get to go on top of that is one concept. And also the fleets are geographically more similar, where there's a lot of boats in 2C that can buy quota in 3A and fish, and vice versa, that they tend to migrate back and forth across the line. Then there's less boats that in 2C would buy quota in, for example, in area 4A to make up for whatever they don't get on their 2C quota.
Isn't that a domestic management thing that you could do already?
So supposedly, what we're developing here is a base allocation formula that is not going to have to be tinkered with domestic allocation. Like the commissioners, hopefully if we're successful here, we're going to meet all of our objectives, and the commissioners are not going to have to say, well, we're going to take some fish from 3A and throw it into 2C because we want to meet these needs on an ad hoc basis every year, right? Isn't that what we're going for?
Ideally. I like the concept and just offering additional flexibility above, you either have biological regions or regulatory areas. It might be worth just revisiting this. Maybe we write in a little bit, well, we won't really write maybe we can write part of the report tonight, but having a definition in for tonight that we'll revisit once we get through the management procedures presentation. So I think I have enough to continue on today if people are okay. I was expecting to get to this point today, but I think if we work through a little bit more, we'll be ahead of the game.
Go to 4:30.
Okay, so we'll go to 4:30. Aha, here's your word primary, Chris. Prioritizing objectives. So that's basically classifying as primary, which would be objectives reported to the commission, or additional objectives. And those additional objectives would be objectives that, and performance metrics that here at the MSAB we'd look at. They'd be available on the MSE Explorer. And once you look at the primary objectives, you might say, oh, I'm having trouble deciding between these three, and you can start using additional objectives to identify those. So the additional ones are, you know, things that people might just say, I'm interested in this, I'm interested in this, and they might, so we already have a lot of objectives out there. But the primary ones are the key ones that would be reported to the commission and used to evaluate the management procedures. A few area specific should be chosen to complement the primary coast-wide objectives. So what the ad hoc working group actually means by there is that we already have these primary coast-wide objectives, and we'll walk through those pretty carefully tomorrow. But we should have some area specific ones to complement those coast-wide objectives. So for an example, you'll see tomorrow is we have this conservation objective of maintaining the biomass above a limit. And a complement to that would be, okay, we're staying above the limit, but we still want the biomass, the spawning biomass distributed in some way because of all the uncertainties in what spawning area and what year is going to contribute to recruitment. That we don't want to pile it up all into one purple blob in Piero's plot, that all of them might have different importance. So we'll see that and we'll talk about that. Conservation objectives should be prioritized over fishery objectives. That was actually a directive from the commission at one of the previous annual meetings, I believe it was. And fishery objectives do not necessarily need to be prioritized because it is often useful to examine the trade-offs between them. It's helpful if they are, it makes the process very clear, but sometimes you might want to examine trade-offs between yield and stability, for example. Or you might want to examine trade-offs between yield in 3A and 2C, for example. So just a reminder that a lot of MSE, the evaluation is evaluating the trade-offs between these different objectives. And those objectives can be trade-offs between different areas. One area is reduced in yield, the other area might go up. If we were to define tolerances by area on certain objectives, that can be used to prioritize among areas. And so, for example, if we have want a certain proportion of spawning biomass in each of the 4 regions, we might say, well, we're willing to have a higher tolerance in this region because we don't know much about it, but we really want a low tolerance in this region 3 or something because we believe that's the main producer of recruitment from the spawning biomass. So tolerances can be used to actually prioritize among areas in these objectives. So those are some concepts talked about by the ad hoc working group. And that brings us now to a review of the harvest strategy policy. So Pierre and I have updated this figure. First thing you might notice is the green is not so blaring anymore. It's actually a cooler color of green, which really pleased me. Yeah. But the biggest thing is there's a big circle in the distribution one now. And so the one comment from the working group, which I didn't make it in the minutes because it was related to this figure and not really the objectives, but I still took note of, is that this could be modified. So I want to walk through this a little bit because it's going to be a key understanding for the rest of the week. So remember, this is the whole harvest strategy policy is how we get from beginning to end in our whole decision-making process. And that includes harvest strategy, which would be this management procedure part, as well as the policy part, and that's the decision-making part from the commissioners. Now, we have some objectives that are going to define management procedures, but there may be other objectives that the commission has to deal with or consider in making their decisions, socioeconomic objectives and things that we might not have defined in developing the management procedure. So what we do is we start with a coast-wide assessment, and we have defined a fishing intensity. So now note, these are circles because they're inputs, and there's a scientific input, which Dr. Stewart does an assessment every year. We're very scientific about that, and he was recently reviewed this past year and got accolades for that assessment, just to note. But that is a science input which provides management advice. And then this is the management input. This is basically the harvest rule of an SPR is defined, which is currently a reference of 46%, and a control rule, which is a 30-20 control rule. You combine that assessment with that management input, and that provides a total mortality, which is an output of that process. Currently, and noting what Chuck brought up earlier, is that this may change, but currently that total mortality is split into a TCY, which is mostly over O26 component, and then the U26 non-directed fishery discard mortality, or the U26 bycatch component. What is then actually distributed among the areas is the TCY portion. And this now component is called the distribution component. So note, we have investigated the scale component already in the coast-wide simulations, but we haven't investigated that. And that's our task now for 2021, is combining these two and coming up with an entire management procedure. What you may notice differs now is, one, inputs are all circles, and they can be science or management input, and distribution procedures is one circle. And that's because it's a combination of science and management inputs. And so, for example, the current, what's listed in these boxes in small text is actually the current interim management procedure. So we have an FSPR 46%, 30-20 control rule. The TCY is distributed in the interim management procedure based on stock distribution determined from the survey, and then relative harvest rates. And we'll talk a little bit more about relative harvest rates later, but those relative harvest rates are part science, part policy in how those relative harvest rates were determined. So when we actually develop management procedures tomorrow, we'll be developing them for the scale and the distribution components, and combining science and policy and sort of just different tools together to come out with the regulatory area mortality limits in terms of a mortality table that's then fed through the commission process. And remember, the final outcome of all of these management procedures is regulatory area mortality limits. That's what's in this table. Go ahead, Adam.
We have talked a number of times in the past about the fact that the commissioners will still make a decision based on the decision table's mortality table. We talked about how deviations from the management procedure will affect the efficacy of those projections. So we talked about factoring in some sort of implementation error. Variability. I'm a manager. I feel like I can say manage. I can say that. Implementation variability, implementation error. When management changes their mind. Would that variability be part of the management procedure? Like, I'm trying to think how we would account for that if someone like the peer review were to consider where that variability is factored in to the MSC process. We identify it as part of the management procedure or part of the overall evaluation?
There will be variability in the management procedure in terms of what's being input into it. Oh, sorry. There will be variability in the management procedure in terms of what's being input into the management procedures in these scientific things. So there's error in the assessment, and that's a source, that's actually a source of uncertainty or error. And then there's going to be error in whatever tools we use in this process, whether it's distributing based on CPUE or survey biomass or proportion of age or whatever it is. So there will be that error as part of the management procedure. What I see as implementation variability as two components. One component is a regulatory area mortality limit is set, but the sector or all the sectors in that regulatory area end up not catching that total limit or exceeding that limit. And that's a source of variability. That's outside the management procedure. And then I see that there's a decision part that the commission will make that will be also outside the management procedure. So what we're considering doing is actually introducing both of those sources of error as implementation variability out after the management procedures applied. So there would be a mortality table, and then all these other lines are where implementation variability come in. Well, the decision-making variability would come in, and then as that's passed to the next annual cycle would be the implementation variability of the sectors themselves.
Okay, thanks.
It'd be interesting to actually put that into this figure as well. Note where those sources of variability come in.
So thanks for that. The way you described it is the way it makes sense to me, or how I envisioned it. The reason I think it's worth noting is I think it was at the ESRB, or maybe I was talking to other folks at home, that the way that this MSC is being developed and implemented is different than some others like sablefish domestically, where it's very much that this is the output, this is what you implement.
Right.
And so there's two camps that see how an MSC should, air quote, should be done. And so I think it'd be helpful to acknowledge, you know, this is the route that's being taken.
Okay. And just to note on that, it is useful as well to do simulations with no error, no variability on them, just to see what could you do in what I've called perfect information or no estimation error. We've done in the past no estimation error. And so that would mean the coast-wide assessment's perfect, all these are perfect, and the decision-making process is exactly what the management procedure says, and the fishery takes exactly what the management procedure says. And then contrast that with the introduction of the variability. But the difficulty is going to be, what is the appropriate implementation variability to model? And we might have to do different scenarios of, let's say that the commission always takes less than the mortality limit says, and just to see the consequences of those and understand it a little bit better.
It's more of a comment, actually, just what you said about comparing the sablefish process and then here. And I think maybe it's be useful to clarify that this is a bilateral commission-based type of process, as opposed to the sablefish is very much one fishery, one manager, and one kind of group. It's kind of, I don't know how you describe that, but it's quite a different type of process. And so when you compare them, they're really quite different. And just the term, I guess, just the language it uses, yeah.
So thanks for pointing that out. I didn't mean it in any sort of pejorative way. It's just, yeah, it's good to be aware that they're very different contexts they're operating in, which probably has led to the fact they've evolved in different ways. Yeah.
I'm just going to look ahead real quick and see where we're at. Oh, this is perfect. This is actually a really good ending point for today. And then tomorrow, yeah, we can pick it up with what the commission directives are and go into the actual objectives. So if anybody has suggestions on this figure, please let me know. And it's always improving, is what I say.
Like the black oil.
So I guess now we're going
Report
into
writing,
report writing, and we can end the online meeting, unless, are we broadcasting that would be pretty exciting. No, I don't think we'll be broadcasting report writing.
Right, yes. So the meeting is still on, but we'll close the webinar where we can draft the report for this afternoon's session.
And tomorrow morning, we'll go over that report, right?
We will. Yes.
Yeah.
And also, did we want to remind people that in just a little bit, or 5:30 social at Urban Family Brewery?
Yeah, I didn't put up a map on that. It's not far
I think it's
away.
just right down the street. Walkable. Yeah. Urban Family Brewery is walkable. And I think that we will go straight into the report writing here. I, just as a reminder, in October, I cannot stay past the 5 p.m. end of the workday for report writing. So if folks on the U.S. side especially would like to stick around, that would be appreciated. Part of my deal in the co-chair situation. Let's just